somewhere in a museum drawer, or maybe still buried under a mound of dirt in southern Iraq. There's a piece of clay smaller than your hand. It's cracked. Part of it is missing, and yet that tiny fragment might be older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than almost anything humans have ever deliberately made to say something to each other. This is where writing begins. Not with poetry, not with philosophy, not with grand declarations of kings. It begins with scratches in wet clay pressed by fingers that turned to dust more than 5,000 years ago. Here's the unsettling part. We can read some of these signs. We can identify numbers, symbols for grain, symbols for livestock, symbols that clearly meant something to somebody once. But full sentences, complete meaning, the whole story these tablets were trying to tell, that's still out of reach. Scholars have spent over a century staring at these fragments, and there are entire archives of the earliest writing that nobody has ever fully translated. Not because we're not smart enough, because the pieces are missing. Because the language itself might be lost, because we're trying to reconstruct a conversation where we can only hear every third word. And that's the mystery we're diving into today. Not aliens, not lost civilizations with laser technology, nothing like that. Something stranger, honestly, a world where humans were figuring out, for the very first time, how to make a symbol mean something permanent, how to trap a thought in mud and have it survive for thousands of years. When you really sit with that idea, it's kind of impossible to wrap your head around it. Every single system of writing on Earth today, English, Chinese, Arabic, all of it, traces back in some way to people who had never seen a written word before, inventing the concept out of nothing. Some have claimed these earliest tablets describe a time before humanity existed, a world that came before us in some cosmic sense. That's not what the evidence actually shows, and we'll get into why that idea is more myth than fact. But strip away the exaggeration, and there's something almost as strange sitting underneath it. These tablets do preserve a world before us in a different sense. A world before recorded history existed at all. A world we only know because a handful of scribes in an ancient city decided to press symbols into clay so they wouldn't forget who owed what to whom. That city was called Uruk, and it's where our story really begins. We're going to walk through how writing emerged there, not as poetry or storytelling, but as something almost boring on the surface. Bookkeeping, grain counts, temple inventories. We'll look at Proto-Cuneiform, the strange ancestor of true writing, and why so much of its context has simply vanished, leaving scholars guessing at meanings they can partially reconstruct but never fully confirm. We'll get into the earliest number systems, the tangled question of what language, if any, these signs represent, and how later Mesopotamian myths remember their own origins in ways that still puzzle historians today. Before we go further, quick favour, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I love seeing these comments roll in. Tokyo at midnight Ohio during a lunch break. Wherever you are, drop it below. It genuinely makes my day scrolling through and seeing this thing reaching people all over the world at every hour imaginable. And if you're enjoying this and want to support the channel, the easiest way is to follow the show on Spotify. Listen there when you can. And if you've got a minute, leave a 5-star review. Links right there in the description. It really does help more than you'd think. Alright, let's step back into that ancient world and figure out what these tablets are actually trying to tell us. Before we can talk about the oldest writing on Earth, we need to answer a much harder question than it sounds like. What actually counts as writing in the first place? Because humans have been making marks for an absurdly long time. We're talking scratches on ochre from over 70,000 years ago in South Africa, cave paintings in France and Spain that go back 30,000 years or more, notched bones, painted handprints, geometric patterns carved into rock faces on nearly every continent. If any scratch or symbol counted as writing, We'd have to push the invention of writing back tens of thousands of years, and honestly, the word would stop meaning anything useful. So scholars had to draw a line somewhere, and the line they landed on is this. Writing is a system capable of representing language, or at minimum, capable of encoding stable information that goes beyond what a single person can hold in their memory. That second part matters just as much as the first. It's not enough for a mark to mean something to the person who made it. A true writing system has to be legible to someone else, someone who wasn't there when the mark was made, someone who can look at those symbols days or years later and pull out the same information the original maker intended. That's the whole point. Writing exists to defeat forgetting. It's a technology for making thought outlive the thinker. Cave art doesn't do that, not in the way we mean here. A painting of a bison might have carried enormous ritual or symbolic weight for the people who made it, but it doesn't encode a specific, repeatable piece of information the way a word or a number does. You can't look at a painted horse and know whether it means 1 horse, 10 horses, a herd belonging to a particular family, or a story about a hunt that happened 3 winters ago. The meaning is fluid, dependent on context that's now lost to us. That's art. That's symbolism. It might even be spiritual record-keeping in some deep human sense. But it isn't writing. Tally marks get closer, but they still fall short. A series of notches on a bone can absolutely encode information, usually a count of something, days, kills, phases of the moon. Some researchers think certain Ice Age bone tallies might even track lunar cycles with real precision. That's impressive. But tally marks are limited to quantity. They can't tell you what's being counted, who owns it, or why it matters. There's no grammar, no distinction between a noun and a number, no way to combine symbols into something more complex than a repeated slash. It's math, in its most stripped down form, but it isn't language. Seals are trickier, and they're actually going to matter a lot later in this story, so hold on to this thought. Stamp seals and cylinder seals were being used in the Near East long before true writing appears, pressed into wet clay to mark ownership or authenticity, sort of like an ancient signature. They carried meaning, sometimes very specific meaning, but a seal is closer to a logo than a sentence. It identifies a person or an institution. It doesn't build up into statements. You can't combine 2 seal impressions to say something new the way you can combine 2 words. Same story with decorative imagery, the pottery designs, the woven patterns, the jewelry motifs that show up across the ancient world. Beautiful, culturally rich, sometimes even standardized enough to suggest shared meaning across a region. But not writing, not yet. So when historians go looking for the actual first appearance of writing, using that stricter definition, a system that encodes language or structured information legibly for someone else, the trail leads to one place with more confidence than anywhere else on Earth. Southern Mesopotamia in the final centuries of the fourth-millennium BCE. Roughly 3,400 to 3,100 BCE, though the dating gets fuzzy at the edges, which we'll come back to. This is where the earliest tablets we can classify as true writing start showing up in the archaeological record, clustered overwhelmingly in and around a city called Uruk. Now, before we go further, it's worth being honest about something. Mesopotamia isn't the only place people point to when this question comes up. Egypt has its own extremely early evidence, inscribed labels and pottery marks from tombs at a site called Abydos, dated by some researchers to almost the same window as the earliest Mesopotamian material, maybe even slightly earlier depending on whose dating you trust. For a while this created a genuine scholarly tug-of-war. Who got there first, the Sumerians or the Egyptians? The honest answer is that we don't fully know, and we might never know with total certainty. Both regions were clearly experimenting with symbolic marking systems around the same broad period, and the gap between them, if there even is one, is small enough that it falls inside the margin of archaeological uncertainty. Part of the problem is preservation, and this is something people don't think about enough when they imagine ancient history. We're not comparing complete records from two civilizations. We're comparing fragments, and the fragments that survive depend enormously on luck, climate, and what people happen to write on. Egyptian early inscriptions were often carved into stone or bone, or written on materials like papyrus that mostly rotted away over the millennia, leaving us with scattered, incomplete evidence. Mesopotamia, on the other hand, had an almost accidental advantage. They wrote primarily on clay, and clay, especially when it gets baked, whether deliberately in a kiln or accidentally in a building fire, becomes remarkably durable. It can survive being buried under a collapsed mud brick city for 5,000 years and come out the other side still legible. That's not because Mesopotamians were more advanced. It's because the material they happened to be using turned out to be a nearly perfect time capsule. So when scholars say southern Mesopotamia has the strongest claim to the earliest known writing, that phrase matters. Strongest claim, not definitive proof of absolute global priority. It means Mesopotamia has given us the largest, clearest, most continuous body of very early written material, tens of thousands of tablets from Uruk and related sites, showing a system that clearly develops and complexifies over time. That density of evidence is what lets historians actually study the invention of writing as a process instead of a single mysterious moment. Egypt might have been doing something similar or even earlier, but we simply don't have the same volume of surviving material to trace it step by step. Here's the part that tends to surprise people the most, though. When you finally get your hands on these earliest tablets, the ones from Uruk dated to roughly 5,000 years ago, they are not what anyone expects. No epic poems, no prayers to the gods, no royal proclamations carved for the ages. Nothing resembling a story at all. What you get instead are lists, grain measurements, counts of sheep and goats, records of labour owed to a temple, tallies of beer rations handed out to workers. The first writing in human history wasn't trying to preserve wisdom or capture a moment of beauty. It was trying to keep track of who owed what to whom, because a growing city had simply gotten too complicated to hold in anyone's head anymore. And that, strangely enough, is exactly why it matters so much. To understand why those first tablets are full of grain, sheep, beer, and labour rations, you have to understand the city that produced them. Uruk was not a village that suddenly decided to invent writing one afternoon. It was one of the first places on Earth where human life had become too large, too dense, too interconnected, and too economically complicated for memory alone to keep up. Uruk stood in southern Mesopotamia, in what is now southern Iraq, on the broad alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Today the site is called Walker, and it looks like a huge spread of dusty mounds rising from the flat landscape. But 5,000 years ago, this was a radically different world. The rivers shifted constantly. Marshes, canals, and cultivated fields stretched across the plain. Reeds grew in the wetlands. Date palms lined settled areas. Boats could move people and goods through waterways that functioned like ancient roads. And in the middle of that landscape, Uruk grew. Not all at once. Not because someone drew a city plan and announced that civilization had begun. Cities do not work like that. Uruk was the result of generations of growth, experimentation, migration, construction, and increasingly intense cooperation. Small farming settlements had existed in southern Mesopotamia for thousands of years before Uruk reached its height. People already knew how to grow barley, raise sheep and goats, make pottery, build with mud brick, and use the rivers. What changed during the Uruk period roughly 4000 to 3100 BCE, was the scale. Everything got bigger, fields got larger, canal networks became more important, buildings expanded into monumental complexes, workshops produced goods in bulk. Trade reached farther, and settlements that had once been relatively small began drawing in more and more people. By the late fourth millennium BCE, Uruk may have covered something like 250 hectares, perhaps more depending on how its occupied area is measured. That would have made it enormous for its time, probably home to tens of thousands of people, or at least a population far beyond anything most earlier communities had sustained. Think about what that means. A small village can run on personal knowledge. You know who planted which field, you know who owns the goats, you know which family needs help after a bad harvest. You know who contributed labour to repair a canal because you watched them do it. If someone takes a basket of grain, everybody knows whose grain it was. But scale that up to a city of thousands. Now people are living among strangers. Workers are arriving from nearby settlements. Farmers are bringing in produce from fields they do not personally own. Herds are being managed by specialists. Craft workers are turning wool into cloth, clay into containers, reeds into baskets, and stone from distant lands into tools or ornaments. Food has to be collected, stored, measured, redistributed, and protected. Labour has to be organised. Canal maintenance has to happen before the water fails. Someone has to know how much grain came in, how much went out, and whether the numbers still make sense. That is where the pressure begins. Southern Mesopotamia was incredibly fertile, but it was not easy. The land depended on water management. Rainfall in the far south was too limited and unpredictable for farming to rely on the sky alone. Agriculture depended on the rivers, on canals, on ditches, on embankments, and on the constant human work of keeping water moving where it needed to go. Too little water, crops fail. Too much water, fields flood. Poor drainage can leave salts in the soil and damage future harvests. A canal system is not just an engineering project. It is a social system. It requires people to coordinate, contribute labour, settle disputes, and obey some kind of shared schedule. And then there were the temples. When people hear the word temple, they often picture a purely religious building, a place where ancient people went to pray. The temples of Uruk were certainly sacred spaces. They were connected to gods, rituals, offerings, and the authority of the divine. But they were also institutions. They held land. They received goods. They employed workers. They organised labour. They stored grain, wool, animals, oil, beer, and other resources. In a city without banks, corporations, ministries, or modern government offices, a major temple complex could do parts of all of those jobs at once. The most famous sacred and administrative zone at Uruk was the Eanna precinct, associated in later periods with the goddess Inanna. Eanna means something like the house of heaven, and the name alone tells you how important this place became in Mesopotamian memory. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of large buildings, platforms, courtyards, halls, and structures rebuilt again and again over centuries. Some of these buildings were decorated with the famous cone mosaics of the Uruk period, thousands of coloured clay cones pressed into plaster to make geometric patterns across walls. This was not casual architecture. It was monumental. It announced power, organisation, resources, and permanence. But the Eanna precinct was not simply a giant religious monument standing apart from ordinary life. It sat at the centre of a system that connected fields, herds, workshops, labour gangs, storehouses, and households across the city and beyond it. Picture the daily flow. Barley arrives from the countryside. Wool comes in from flocks. Fish, dates, reeds, bitumen, and animal products enter the system. Some goods are stored. Some are redistributed as rations. Some are transformed by workers into cloth, beer, bread, baskets, tools, or offerings. Some are exchanged with communities far away. Southern Mesopotamia had rich mud and fertile soil, but it lacked many raw materials. There was little timber, little stone, and almost no metal. So Uruk depended on trade networks reaching into the mountains and neighbouring regions for wood, copper, hard stone, and other resources. That means the city was not just consuming, it was coordinating. And coordination creates paperwork. Or, before paper existed, clay work. The earliest tablets from Uruk were found in and around institutional contexts, especially buildings connected to the Iana precinct. That matters because it tells us where writing likely first became useful. Not around a campfire, not as private poetry, not as a king trying to immortalize his victories. The evidence points much more strongly toward administration. Someone needed a durable way to record deliveries, allocations, and obligations inside a large organization where goods passed through many hands. A person could remember that a worker received beer yesterday. Maybe even that 10 workers received beer yesterday. But could they remember how much barley entered the storehouse 3 months ago? How much was issued to textile workers? How many sheep remained after breeding season? And whether a team from a nearby settlement had completed its assigned canal labour? Maybe one exceptionally gifted official could hold a terrifying amount of detail in their head. But institutions cannot depend on one person's memory forever. People die, people lie, people forget. And in a city growing as fast as Uruk, the numbers eventually become bigger than the human brain can safely carry. So the marks on clay were not a random intellectual breakthrough. They were an answer to a very practical problem. How do you make obligations visible? How do you make a delivery last longer than the conversation in which it happened? How do you prove that 20 jars of oil came in, or that 30 workers were fed, or that a herd was counted before it disappeared into someone else's care? You make a record. But even that makes Uruk sound too clean, too organised, like a modern office building with mud brick walls. The real city was probably messier. Its institutions changed over time. Its neighbourhoods grew, shifted, and competed. Its buildings were demolished and rebuilt. Its people included farmers, herders, potters, weavers, boatmen, labourers, priests, administrators, merchants, and families whose names have vanished completely. Some had influence, many did not. Some benefited from the new system. Others probably carried its heaviest burdens, digging canals, hauling bricks, processing grain, and receiving measured rations in return. Uruk was not civilization arriving in one dramatic flash. It was a world becoming more complicated year after year until old ways of organizing life stopped being enough. And that is the crucial point. Writing did not appear because humans suddenly became intelligent. Humans had been intelligent for a very long time. It appeared because this particular kind of society created a new problem. A city of institutions, storehouses, workforces, trade routes, and managed resources needed memory outside the body. It needed information that could survive the person who counted it. It needed marks that could travel from one official to another without changing meaning along the way. The first tablets were born from that need, but Uruk did not go from no records to writing overnight. Before anyone pressed those first signs into clay, people had already spent centuries developing smaller, stranger ways to track goods, ownership, and exchange. Little systems that look almost primitive at first glance, but which may have prepared the ground for everything that came next. Those smaller systems began with objects so simple they can seem almost disappointing. Small lumps of clay, cones, spheres, discs, tetrahedrons, tiny shapes that fit in the palm of your hand. Archaeologists call them tokens. For thousands of years before the first known writing tablets appeared at Uruk, people across parts of the ancient Near East used these little clay objects. Some were plain and simple: a cone, a ball, a disc. Others were more elaborate, marked with lines, dots, or patterns. Their exact meanings are still debated, because nobody left us an instruction manual saying, "This shape means 1 jar of oil, this one means 10 measures of barley, this one means a sheep." But many researchers think that is close to what at least some tokens did. They may have been counters. Imagine a household, a farm, or a temple storehouse long before writing. Grain comes in after harvest. Sheep are moved between herders. Oil is delivered in jars. Cloth is issued to workers. You need some way to keep track. Not a story, not a prayer. Not a person's name spelled out in signs. Just a basic fact. 5 sheep, 10 baskets, 20 measures of grain. A small clay token can do that. One shape might stand for a particular commodity. Another might stand for a quantity. Put several together, and you have a physical record. Not writing in the full sense, because the objects do not necessarily represent spoken words or sounds. But they can represent information. They can make an invisible number visible. And that may have been enough. Think about how powerful that is in a world without paper, calculators, receipts, or spreadsheets. If a herder delivers 12 animals to an institution, the official does not have to trust memory alone. The count can be externalized. It exists outside anybody's head. The tokens can be gathered, counted, moved, stored, and checked later. They are tiny pieces of portable memory. Some of the earliest tokens date back as far as the 9th millennium BCE, thousands of years before the great city of Uruk, and thousands more before the first readable sentences in Mesopotamia. That enormous time gap matters. It means we should be careful. A clay token from an early farming community is not automatically a direct ancestor of a Proto-Cuneiform sign from Uruk. History is rarely that neat. Systems change, meanings disappear. Different regions borrow, adapt, and invent things independently. But there is a pattern here that is hard to ignore. As economies became more complex, the tokens often became more complex too. Early tokens tend to be simple geometric forms. Later examples include a wider range of shapes and markings, perhaps corresponding to a wider range of goods, units, or transactions. That makes sense. A small farming village may only need to track a few basic things. Grain, animals, maybe jars of oil, but a growing institution has more problems. Different grades of grain, different kinds of livestock. Wool, textiles, labour, beer, bread, land, containers. Deliveries from one place, rations issued somewhere else. The more complicated the system becomes, the more complicated its memory has to become. And then people came up with an even stranger solution. Instead of keeping tokens loose in a bag or basket, they began sealing them inside hollow clay envelopes. Archaeologists call these envelopes bullae. A bulla was made by wrapping wet clay around a group of tokens, creating a sealed ball or pouch. The tokens were trapped inside. To know exactly what was in it, you had to break it open. At first that sounds incredibly inefficient. Why put a record inside a clay shell where nobody can read it? But picture the problem it solved. Suppose goods are being sent from one official to another, or from a village to a storehouse, or from a herder to a temple institution. The sender puts the agreed tokens inside the clay envelope. Then the outside is sealed. When the recipient receives it, they can break it open and compare the tokens to the goods delivered. If the token count matches, the delivery is accepted. If it does not, somebody has a problem. The bulla is not just a container. It is a control device. It creates a record that is difficult to alter without leaving evidence. You cannot quietly remove 3 tokens from the inside and pretend nothing happened. You have to break the envelope, and once the envelope is broken, everyone knows the record has been opened. Then comes the next step, and this is where the story begins to look much more like writing. Some bullae have impressions on their outer surfaces that appear to match the tokens sealed inside them. A cone-shaped token might be pressed into the wet clay. A round token might leave its own mark. Now the outside of the envelope gives a preview of the information inside. You may no longer need to break it open just to see the count. Eventually, according to the classic version of this story, the envelope becomes unnecessary. Why keep the tokens inside a clay ball if you can press their shapes directly onto a flat piece of clay? Why carry around a 3-dimensional counter when a 2-dimensional impression can preserve the same information? Flatten the clay, press or draw the signs into it, and suddenly you are very close to the earliest numerical tablets. This theory, associated especially with archaeologist Denise Schmant-Besserat, became one of the most influential explanations for the origins of writing. In its strongest form, it suggests that Mesopotamian writing grew out of a long accounting tradition. Tokens became token impressions, impressions became signs, and signs eventually expanded into a full system capable of recording language. It is an elegant story, maybe too elegant, because not every specialist agrees that the evidence proves such a direct line. There are similarities between some token forms and early numerical signs. There are bullae with token impressions. There is no question that ancient Mesopotamian institutions were deeply concerned with counting, measuring, sealing, and controlling goods. But similarities do not automatically prove descent. Some scholars argue that tokens and tablets may have been related parts of a broader administrative world, without one simply turning into the other. Others point out that the earliest tablets use sign systems more varied and sophisticated than a straightforward token-to-tablet progression might predict. The problem is the usual problem with deep history. We have fragments, we have surviving objects, we have patterns. What we do not have is the missing meeting where an administrator said, "Forget these clay counters, let's invent a tablet." Still, even if the neat evolutionary chain is too simple, the larger insight remains powerful. Counting may have come before writing words. That should not surprise us. A complex institution does not first need to write poetry. It first needs to know whether its grain is missing. It needs to know whether the workers got their rations. It needs to know how many sheep entered the fold and how many left. It needs to know whether a delivery was real, whether a claim was authorized, whether somebody had opened a container they were not supposed to open. Before people used clay to preserve speech, they may have used it to preserve obligations. And that brings us to seals. A seal is one of the clearest signs that information was becoming tied to authority. In ancient Mesopotamia, people used stamp seals and, later, cylinder seals to mark clay. A stamp seal could be pressed into wet clay like a signature. A cylinder seal was even more remarkable, a small carved stone cylinder rolled across wet clay to create a continuous image. The designs could include animals, humans, divine symbols, ritual scenes, geometric patterns, or scenes of labor and authority. Each seal was distinctive. In a world where many people could not read, an image could still identify an office, a household, an institution, or an individual. Pressing a seal into clay said something important. This jar was closed under someone's authority. This door was secured. This bundle was approved. This shipment was accounted for. This record was not just a lump of clay. It had been witnessed, authorized, claimed. That does not mean seals made fraud impossible. Human beings have always been creative when there is something valuable to steal. But seals made control more visible. A broken ceiling could reveal that a storeroom had been opened. A seal impression could connect an object to the person or institution responsible for it. A cylinder seal could turn a piece of clay into something like an administrative fingerprint. And once again, the central issue was not language. It was trust. Uruk was full of goods moving between people who could not all know one another personally. Grain could travel from field to storehouse, wool from flock to workshop, beer from brewery to labour gang. Imported stone or metal could pass through many hands before becoming a finished object. Each movement created opportunities for confusion, dispute, loss or theft. Tokens counted, bullae enclosed, sealings authenticated. Together, they formed a kind of administrative technology before writing had fully arrived. Not civilization in the romantic sense. No epic heroes. No royal boasts. No creation myths carved for eternity. Just clay, quantities, containers, and the growing realization that a large society could not survive on memory and trust alone. But the pressure kept increasing. At some point, marks on clay had to do more than confirm a sealed delivery. They had to identify goods more precisely. They had to distinguish one kind of grain from another, one institution from another, one worker group from another. Numbers alone were no longer enough. And in the crowded administrative world of Uruk, those marks were about to become something new. And that new thing appeared in layers of earth at Uruk, not in a single dramatic moment, not with one inventor pressing the first sign into clay and announcing that writing had been born. Archaeology almost never gives us beginnings that clean. What it gives us are deposits, floors built over older floors, walls cut through earlier rubbish, broken vessels, ceilings, ash, tools, bones, and, in a few extraordinary cases, tablets. At Uruk, the earliest known writing belongs mainly to what archaeologists call the Uruk 5 and Uruk 3 horizons. The labels sound technical because they are technical. They refer to archaeological levels, layers within the Great Mound of Uruk. Uruk 4 is generally placed around 3,400 to 3,200 BCE, though exact dates vary depending on the chronology used. Uruk the 30 comes after it, roughly 3,200 to 3,000 BCE. And somewhere across this transition in the late fourth millennium BCE, marks on clay became a system we can reasonably call writing. Not writing as we know it, not yet. The earliest tablets from Uruk are usually called Proto-Cuneiform. Proto means early or preliminary. Cuneiform means wedge-shaped, from the Latin word for wedge. But Proto-Cuneiform is not simply cuneiform with fewer signs. It is a different stage of the system, a world still in the process of becoming readable. Later Mesopotamian scribes would press a reed stylus into clay, creating the famous wedge-shaped strokes that became cuneiform. They would use signs for words, syllables, grammatical endings, names, prayers, laws, letters, hymns, stories, and royal propaganda. Their writing could record speech in astonishing detail. The first tablets could not do all that, at least not in any way we can fully recover. Many of their signs still look recognizably pictorial: a head, a jar, a fish, a stalk of grain, an animal, a vessel. But even here appearances can mislead. These were not little pictures drawn because someone wanted to make art. They were signs in an administrative system. A picture of a jar might refer to a specific type of container, a product measured in containers, or an institutional category we no longer understand. A head might mean a person, labour, an official, or something connected to the word for head. The image is only the surface. The meaning lies somewhere underneath, and much of that meaning has been buried for 5,000 years. The transformation seems to have happened through convention. At first, a mark may resemble the thing it refers to. That is useful. If you are inventing a way to track sheep, A rough sheep sign is easier to remember than a completely abstract symbol. But once many people start using the same sign again and again, the need for a realistic drawing begins to fade. Think about a modern dollar sign. Nobody looks at it and sees an actual dollar. It is not a picture of money, it is a convention. The same thing happened at Uruk, only much earlier. Signs were repeated so often that they became standardized. A scribe did not need to draw a perfect fish every time. They needed to make the accepted fish sign quickly and clearly enough that another trained person could recognize it. Over generations, the signs became simpler, more regular, more detached from the objects they may once have depicted. This is one of the strangest things about the first writing. The more useful it became, the less it had to look like the world, and the tablets themselves changed too. Some early records preserve impressions, probably connected to the older world of tokens and sealings. But increasingly, signs were drawn or incised into soft clay with a pointed tool. The tablet became a flat field where information could be arranged in rows and boxes. Numerical signs could sit beside commodity signs. A quantity could be connected to grain, beer, animals, textiles, land, or labourers. Information that once required physical counters could now be compressed into marks. A few strokes of clay could stand in for a herd. A cluster of signs could stand in for a delivery. A tablet could stand in for somebody's memory. That sounds simple. It was not. Proto-Cuneiform used hundreds of signs, perhaps more than 1,000 depending on how variants are counted. Some signs appear only once or a few times. Others recur constantly. Many are clear enough in a broad sense. Researchers can identify numerical notations, recognize signs associated with barley or sheep, and see the repetitive structures of accounts. But knowing that a tablet concerns animals is not the same as translating it. Imagine finding a spreadsheet from a company that vanished 5,000 years ago. You can recognize columns. You can see repeated symbols. You can tell it probably tracks inventories or payments. But the headings are in an unknown shorthand. The units are unfamiliar. The names may be absent, and half the page is broken away. That is Proto-Cuneiform, and this is why the dates matter. When archaeologists say a tablet belongs to Uruk IV or Uruk III, they are not usually reading a date written on the tablet itself. Clay tablets from this period rarely come with anything like a modern calendar year. Instead, they are dated through context. Which layer did the tablet come from? What pottery was found beside it? What kind of architecture surrounded it? Which seals, tools, and other objects occurred in the same deposit? How does the tablet's sign style compare with tablets from better understood sequences? A tablet found in a sealed, carefully excavated layer is enormously valuable. Its position in the ground gives it a place in time. But not every tablet has that advantage. Many early tablets were excavated more than a century ago, when archaeological methods were not always what they are today. Some came from disturbed deposits. Some were broken, displaced, or found in dumps where ancient people had thrown away old records. Others entered collections through the antiquities market with little or no reliable provenance at all. And clay itself usually cannot be radiocarbon dated. It is just baked mud, unless there is associated organic material, like charcoal from a secure layer. Archaeologists have to build the date from the surrounding evidence. So the chronology is strong in broad outline, but not perfect in every detail. Uruk IV appears to preserve some of the earliest experiments in the system. Uruk III shows a larger and more developed body of tablets, with signs becoming increasingly standardized and administrative formats becoming more regular. The script was not frozen. It was evolving fast, pushed by the needs of institutions that were becoming bigger, richer, and harder to manage. More goods, more workers, more categories, more chances for someone to lose track. But here is the part that should make us cautious. The tablets we have are not the first archive. They are the survivors of one. Most clay tablets were never meant to last 5,000 years. Many were probably dried in the sun, not fired in a kiln. They could crumble in water, dissolve in rain, be recycled into new clay, or simply be smashed and discarded when the account was no longer needed. Even tablets that survived may survive only as fragments. A corner with 3 signs, a broken edge with a number, a surface worn almost smooth by time. What we have is a sample of a sample. A tiny fraction of the records once made at Uruk. And Uruk itself was only one city in a much larger Mesopotamian world. There may have been thousands of tablets that recorded shipments, rations, fields, workshops, animals, labour gangs, and institutional obligations, then vanished without leaving a trace. There may have been documents on wood, wax, leather, fibre, or other materials that decayed completely. There may have been entire categories of writing that were never preserved, because clay happened to survive where everything else did not. The first writing we can see is not necessarily the first writing that existed. It is the writing the earth allowed us to find, and that survival was no accident. Clay had one property that made it more powerful than almost any other material available to the people of Uruk. You could shape it in seconds, mark it while wet, seal it, store it, erase it before it dried, and if fire touched it, whether in a kiln, a burning building, or a catastrophe, the record could become harder than stone. Humanity had found an archive hiding in mud, and that is the secret of clay. Not that it was beautiful, not that it was rare, not that it inspired people the way gold, ivory, or carved stone might inspire them. Clay was everywhere, along the Euphrates and Tigris, rivers flooded, retreated, and left behind enormous deposits of fine mud. You did not need to dig deep for it. You did not need a mine, a mountain expedition, or a trade caravan. You needed water, clay, and hands. Mix the clay until it becomes soft enough to shape. Roll it into a ball, flatten it into a small cushion. Press marks into the surface, and suddenly you have something astonishingly useful. A record. If the information changed before the clay dried, the solution was simple. Smooth the surface with a wet hand and start again. No expensive parchment ruined, no stone slab wasted, no metal plate melted down. The material was cheap enough to make mistakes on. That matters more than it sounds. Writing did not begin as a luxury art form. It began because people needed a practical way to track a world that was becoming too large, too busy, and too complicated to hold inside anyone's head. Grain came in, beer went out, sheep were counted, wool was distributed. Workers received rations. Fields produced harvests. Storehouses filled and emptied. Clay was built for this kind of world. And Mesopotamia had another advantage. Reeds. Reeds grew in wetlands and along riverbanks in vast quantities. They could be cut, shaped, and used as tools. Early scribes often used a pointed implement to draw or incise signs into wet clay. Over time, scribes increasingly used reed styluses cut at an angle. Press the angled end into clay, and it leaves a triangular impression. Repeat that motion in different directions, and the familiar wedge-shaped script begins to emerge. Cuneiform was not invented because someone loved wedges. It was invented because pressing was faster than drawing. Think about the difference between sketching a picture and stamping a mark. A pointed tool drags through the clay. It takes time. It creates lines that can blur or overlap. A cut reed can be pressed down quickly, leaving a clear, repeatable impression. For a scribe producing account after account, day after day, speed and consistency mattered. The tool changed the writing. and the writing changed the tool. A tablet could be tiny, no larger than a modern cookie, holding a short receipt or a numerical account. Others were palm-sized, carefully organized into rows and compartments. Some were larger, intended for longer lists or more complex records. The shape itself could carry information. A round tablet, a rectangular tablet, a pillow-shaped tablet, a cone, a tag, a sealed lump of clay. Different formats served different administrative needs. This was not one object called a tablet, it was an entire technology. Some records were made as clay ceilings. A container door, basket, or bundle could be secured with a cord, then covered with wet clay. An official rolled a cylinder seal or pressed a stamp seal into the clay. The impression identified the authority behind the transaction, or at least the person responsible for it. A seal was more than decoration. It could say, "This shipment was checked. This storeroom was closed. This jar belongs to this institution. This bundle passed through these hands." In a world without printed labels, photographs, signatures, or digital passwords, the seal impression created a visible chain of responsibility. Break the clay ceiling, and everyone knew the container had been opened. Then there were clay envelopes before, and alongside the earliest tablets. People sometimes placed tokens inside hollow clay balls, often called bullae. The tokens could represent quantities or categories of goods. A person could seal the outside of the envelope, sometimes impressing token shapes into its surface. To check the account, you had to break it open. It was secure, but it was also inconvenient. So eventually, the outside marks became more useful than the tokens hidden inside. Why keep opening the envelope if the information could be recorded directly on clay? The tablet did not appear from nowhere. It emerged from a long series of practical solutions, each one trying to make accounting faster, clearer, and harder to dispute. And once a tablet existed, it had to go somewhere. We should be careful here. The earliest archives are difficult to reconstruct because many tablets were found broken, scattered, reused, or dumped after their immediate purpose had ended. But later, Mesopotamian evidence makes the general principle clear. Tablets could be stacked, placed in baskets, stored in jars, kept on shelves, or grouped in rooms dedicated to records. Some archives used clay labels to identify collections. Some tablets were arranged by type, date, institution, or subject. An archive did not have to look like a modern library. It could look like a storeroom full of mud objects. But those mud objects had a remarkable advantage over almost everything else human beings used to preserve information. They could survive disaster. Most tablets were probably dried in the sun rather than deliberately fired in kilns. Sun-dried clay is durable in a dry room, but it is still vulnerable. Rain can soften it, floodwater can damage it, a careless hand can break it. Old tablets could be soaked, kneaded, and recycled into fresh clay. But if a building burned, something strange could happen. The fire that destroyed the archive could preserve it. Heat drives water from clay and changes it permanently. A soft tablet becomes ceramic. The record that may have been intended to last a season, a year, or only until the next audit can become hard enough to outlive the institution that created it. A palace burns. A temple collapses. A storeroom is buried beneath mud brick and rubble, and the accounts survive. Not always intact, not always readable. But surviving, that is why the ancient Near East has given us hundreds of thousands of clay tablets, while other forms of early record keeping have almost vanished. Wood rots, leather decays, plant fibre disintegrates, wax melts, cracks, or disappears, ink fades, cloth is eaten by insects. Even oral records, which may have carried laws, genealogies, myths, agreements, and technical knowledge for generations, leave no direct archaeological trace at all. This does not mean clay was the only medium people used. It means clay was the medium that won the war against time. And that creates a problem. Everything we think we know about the earliest writing may be distorted by survival bias. We see clay because clay survived. We see administration because administrative tablets were repeatedly made in clay. We see grain, sheep, labour, beer, textiles, and institutional accounts, because those were the things most likely to be pressed into mud and buried in dry Mesopotamian soil. But what about messages written on wood, agreements scratched onto leather, teaching materials painted on fibre, songs, rituals, family histories, and local stories held only in memory? They may have existed, many almost certainly did in later periods. But for the earliest age of writing, much of that world is gone beyond recovery. So when we open the first archive, we are not opening the whole past. We are opening the part of the past that happened to harden. And what hardened first was not poetry, not philosophy, not a king's heroic speech. It was the machinery of everyday life, and that machinery had to be visible, at least at first. Look at some of the earliest signs from Uruk, and they seem almost familiar. A head of grain, a fish, an animal, a jar, a human figure. You can understand the temptation immediately. Maybe writing began when somebody simply drew the things they wanted to record. A sheep looks like a sheep. A jar looks like a jar. A bundle of grain looks like grain. Simple, except it wasn't. Because these marks were not paintings, and they were not meant to capture the full appearance of the world. They were working signs used by trained people inside a system of accounting. Their job was not to make a stranger say, "Yes, that is a beautiful picture of a cow." Their job was to make someone in an institution recognize a category, a transaction, an obligation, or a quantity. That is a completely different thing. Imagine a mark that began as a rough drawing of a grain stalk. The earliest version might have been recognizable enough, but then it gets used again, and again, thousands of times. Scribes need to make it quickly. They need to fit it into neat rows. They need other scribes to recognize it instantly. The tiny details that make it look like an actual plant become less important than the features that make it distinct from every other sign on the tablet. So the picture changes. It becomes simpler, more regular, more conventional. Eventually, what began as an image is no longer really an image at all. It is a sign that people have learned to read. Think about a modern dollar sign. Nobody thinks it is a picture of money. A red octagon does not resemble the act of stopping. A restroom symbol is not a portrait of a man or a woman. These marks work because we have learned the code. The earliest scribes were building one of the first codes in history. And the code could do more than point at an object. A sign that once represented grain might refer to grain as a physical product. But in a specific account, it could also indicate a type of ration, a field product, a storehouse category, or perhaps a particular kind of processed grain. A jar-like sign might mean a container, or it might stand for what the container held. Beer, oil, grain, or another commodity. An animal sign might indicate a sheep, a flock, a class of livestock, or an administrative category connected to animals. The exact meaning depended on context, and context is exactly what we often do not have. Many of the earliest tablets are short lists. A cluster of signs, numerical notations, perhaps a seal impression, sometimes a layout that clearly suggests careful organization. But there is no helpful sentence saying, "On this day, the temple distributed these goods to these workers." There are no verbs explaining what happened, no grammar we can confidently follow from beginning to end. Just marks, repeated marks, marks that must have made perfect sense to the people who used them, This is why the first writing can feel so close and so unreachable at the same time. We can see that a tablet concerns livestock, containers, grain, textiles, or labour. We can often identify patterns. We can compare one tablet to another. We can watch signs appear in repeated combinations. But identifying the general subject is not the same as translating every sign. Seeing a fish-shaped mark does not prove it means fish. It might. Sometimes the most obvious answer is probably close to right. But a picture can become a label, and a label can become an idea. Once that happens, visual resemblance becomes dangerous evidence. A sign may preserve the ghost of an object long after its meaning has shifted. This happened in writing systems all over the world. The letter A began, long ago, as a stylized image connected to an ox head in a Semitic alphabetic tradition. But when you see an A now, you do not read ox. You read a sound. The history of the shape and the meaning of the sign have separated. Something similar was beginning to happen in Mesopotamia, though in a much more complicated way. Early proto-cuneiform signs could operate on several levels at once. One sign might be a picture. It might be a category. It might stand for a word in the language spoken by the scribe. Later, in fully developed cuneiform signs, could also represent syllables or sounds, allowing scribes to write names, grammatical endings, actions and ideas that could never be drawn directly. But at the beginning, we are watching that transformation in progress. Not a clean moment when pictures suddenly became writing, more like a long, messy process in which pictures were being turned into tools. Consider labourers. Some early signs appear to involve human figures or marks associated with people. But what are they recording? Individual workers? Groups of workers? A labour category? A work assignment? Dependents receiving food? Male and female labourers? Officials supervising the work? In some cases, scholars have strong interpretations based on later writing and recurring patterns. In others, the meaning remains disputed. The tablet may show us that people were being counted. It may not tell us, in words we can fully recover, what those people thought of being counted. The same caution applies to containers. A sign that looks like a vessel may seem easy, but ancient administrations cared intensely about capacity, contents, quality, ownership, destination, and purpose. One jar sign could be part of a classification system far more precise than pot. A jar for beer is not just a jar. A jar for oil is not just a jar. A sealed jar entering a temple storehouse is not just a jar at all. It is an entry in a chain of responsibility. And that is the key to these strange early images. They did not exist alone. They lived inside systems. They were surrounded by numbers, neighbouring signs, tablet formats, ceilings and the expectations of the institutions that used them. A sign was not merely saying, "This is a sheep." It may have been saying, "This many sheep of this category, assigned to this place, under this authority." The image was only the surface. Underneath it was an entire world of rules. Over generations, scribes learned those rules through repetition. Apprentices copied signs. They memorized standard forms. They learned which marks belonged together and which did not. A sign became less dependent on resemblance because its meaning was carried by tradition. You did not need it to look exactly like grain if every trained scribe knew what the grain sign was. That is how writing escapes the limits of drawing. A drawing has to resemble something. A written sign only has to be recognized. And once a sign can be recognized, it can begin to carry things no picture can hold. Names, places, actions, titles, sounds, absences, promises, debts, gods, events that happened yesterday, events someone feared might happen tomorrow. But the earliest tablets had not fully crossed that threshold yet. They stand at the edge of it. They are filled with pictures that are already becoming something else. Images hardened into conventions, conventions becoming language. Language still partly hidden behind a code that no living person was taught to read from the beginning. And before scribes could write sentences about the world, they had to solve an even more basic problem. How do you count it? The answer was not 1, 2, 3. Not yet, to a modern reader. A number seems like the simplest kind of writing. A symbol stands for a quantity. Add enough symbols together and you get a total. Universal, clean, almost outside language. But the first scribes of Uruk were not using one neat numerical system. They were using several. And that is one of the strangest things about the earliest tablets. The numbers often look more orderly than the words around them. A tablet may contain a repeated commodity sign, a few marks that can be recognized as numerical notations, perhaps a total set apart in a different position. Even when the accompanying signs remain uncertain, the arithmetic can sometimes be reconstructed. We may not know exactly what happened, but we can see that somebody counted it. Grain was counted, sheep and goats were counted, jars of liquid were counted. Fields were measured, workers were counted, and labour itself may have been measured in units of time or expected work. The tablets are full of quantities because quantities were the point. An institution cannot run on vague impressions. You cannot manage a storehouse by saying, "We seem to have quite a lot of barley." You need to know how much came in, how much went out, how much remains, who received it, and whether the person responsible for it can account for the difference. That pressure, more than poetry or storytelling, may have pushed writing forward. Before people used clay tablets to preserve myths, prayers, royal victories and love songs, they used them to make the world countable. But countable did not mean simple. Take grain. Grain could be stored in containers of different sizes. It could be distributed as rations. It could be measured by volume, by weight, by loads, perhaps by categories of processed and unprocessed product. A system designed to count individual sheep would not necessarily work for a mountain of barley. One sheep is one sheep. Grain is not a collection of separate objects. It is a flow, a substance. It must be measured. Land created another problem. A field is not a jar, and it is not an animal. You need to record length, width, and area. You need units that can describe boundaries and plots large enough to matter to a temple or household. And when labour enters the picture, the calculation becomes more complicated still. Are you counting people, work days, teams, rations issued to workers? The amount of work expected from a group over a season. Each category demanded its own logic, so Proto-Cuneiform scribes developed specialized numerical notations, different systems for different kinds of things. One set of signs could be used for discrete objects, such as animals or containers. Another for grain and other measured commodities. Another for land. Another for capacities. The same looking numerical mark might not always represent the same value in every context. That is a nightmare for anyone hoping the earliest writing will behave like a modern spreadsheet. Imagine finding a page from an unknown civilization. You recognize a mark that seems to mean 10. Then you find the same mark elsewhere, beside a different category, and now it may function within another measuring system entirely. It is still numerical, it still contributes to a quantity. But the unit behind it has changed. 10. What? 10 animals? 10 jars? 10 measures of grain? 10 units in a system whose exact value has vanished with the people who invented it? That question matters. A number without its unit can be precise and mysterious at the same time. And yet, numerical notation gives scholars a foothold. The marks repeat in structured sequences. Their placement often follows patterns. Smaller values combine into larger ones. Totals can sometimes be checked against entries. If a tablet has several lines recording amounts of a commodity and a final notation that appears to sum them, the logic becomes visible even if every word does not. Arithmetic leaves tracks. A scribe may be dead for more than 5,000 years, their language uncertain, their institution destroyed, their purpose forgotten. But if they recorded 3 amounts and then wrote a total, the numbers can still expose part of the system. This is why some proto-cuneiform tablets can be analysed with surprising confidence at the level of quantity. Scholars can often say, this tablet appears to concern a certain amount of grain. Or, this seems to list livestock in several categories. Or, this record tracks labour groups and their associated rations. But then comes the harder question, why? Suppose a tablet records a total of animals. Is it an inventory, a delivery, a tax obligation, a redistribution from one storehouse to another? Animals assigned for breeding? Animals slaughtered for a feast? A projection of what should exist rather than what actually existed. The numbers alone cannot tell us. Even a perfectly understood total does not automatically reveal the transaction behind it. Modern receipts make this seem obvious because they include dates, names, prices, tax categories, addresses, and labels printed in a familiar language. But strip those words away and leave only columns of figures, and the meaning begins to collapse. Was money paid? Was stock counted? Was a debt settled? Was something missing? The earliest tablets often leave us in exactly that position. We can see the skeleton of administration, quantities arranged in rows, categories separated, totals calculated, a system of control operating with careful precision. But the living event behind the record remains partly hidden. We do not always know whether a quantity represents abundance, shortage, obligation, payment, loss, or power. And power is everywhere in these numbers. To count grain is to decide who receives grain. To count workers is to turn human effort into an administrative category. To measure land is to define what can be claimed, taxed, worked, and controlled. The first writing was not just describing the world. It was helping institutions organize it. But there is one final complication. We can often recognize that a sequence is numerical before we can fully understand the signs beside it. The quantities may be clearer than the words. The mathematics can survive where the language does not. Which raises an unsettling possibility. What if the earliest tablets are telling us exactly how much of something existed, moved, or was owed, but not in a language we can fully recover? What if the numbers are the part we can still hear, while the words around them belong to a world that has almost gone silent? The numbers are the part we can still hear, but the words around them, that is where the silence gets deeper. For more than a century, many scholars have connected Proto-Cuneiform, the earliest writing from Uruk, to the Sumerian language. And there are good reasons for that. A few centuries after the first tablets appear, southern Mesopotamia gives us texts written in recognizable Sumerian. The signs have changed, the writing has become more systematic. Scribes are recording more of the sounds of speech. Grammar begins to emerge from the clay, and some of the old signs seem to continue forward. A sign used in early administrative records may later appear in a Sumerian context with a known Sumerian value. Lists of occupations, animals, vessels, foods, and places create bridges between the earliest tablets and the later readable texts. The same bureaucratic world seems to be growing more elaborate, not being replaced overnight by something entirely new. So the simplest explanation is powerful. Proto-Cuneiform was probably developed by people speaking early Sumerian, or at least by institutions where Sumerian was central, but probably is doing a lot of work there. because the first tablets do not write Sumerian the way later scribes wrote Sumerian. They barely write language at all. That sounds strange, because we call them writing. But early writing does not have to capture every part of a spoken sentence. A modern shopping list can say grain, 3 jars, workers total. It may be perfectly useful to the person who made it. But it does not tell us who did what when it happened, whether the grain arrived or left, whether the workers received rations or owed labour. Proto-Cuneiform often works like that. It can record a commodity, a person or category of person, a number, a place, institution, or official designation. But it frequently leaves out the little pieces that make language unmistakable: verb endings, case markers, pronouns, particles, tense, and word order clear enough to reconstruct a sentence. Those are exactly the details scholars need when they want to identify a language with confidence. Later, Sumerian is readable because it gives us more than labels. It gives us grammar. A later tablet can tell us that someone gave something, received something, built something, dedicated something, complained about something. Its signs can represent words, syllables, and grammatical endings. The language comes alive as connected speech. The earliest tablets usually do not do that. They give us fragments, categories, headings, amounts. Administrative shorthand written for people who already understood the system. Imagine trying to identify English from a warehouse inventory that says wheat 30, sheep 12, men 8, storehouse. You might recognize some words if you knew English already, but you would not have much grammar to work with. Now imagine the words are written with symbols whose exact meanings have shifted over thousands of years. That is the problem. When scholars say an early sign may have a Sumerian reading, they often mean that a later Sumerian word provides the best available clue. They do not necessarily mean that the tablet preserves a fully readable Sumerian sentence. A sign can have several layers. It may refer to an object, like grain. It may stand for a word associated with grain. It may be read aloud in one way by a Sumerian speaker. It may be understood differently by someone else working in the same institution. And it may function simply as an administrative category, almost like a symbol on a modern shipping label. A picture of a fragile glass does not tell you what language the warehouse workers speak. It tells you how the package should be handled. The same is true, in a more complicated way, for the earliest signs. A sign identifying sheep may have been connected to a Sumerian word for sheep. That is possible, maybe likely. But the existence of the sign does not prove that every scribe, labourer, trader, or official in Uruk spoke Sumerian as their first language. It does not even prove that the sign was always being silently read, as a spoken word. In some cases, it may have operated as a conventional marker within a system of accounting. And Uruk was not a tiny, isolated village. It was one of the first great cities on earth. Its institutions drew in grain, animals, labour, stone, wood, metals and people from a huge surrounding world. Trade and contact linked southern Mesopotamia to regions where other languages were certainly spoken. Later, Mesopotamia would become famously multilingual, with Sumerian, Akkadian, and other languages moving through the same cities, temples, palaces, and scribal schools. There is no reason to assume that the earliest administrative world was linguistically simple. Maybe Sumerian was the dominant language of the institutions that created Proto-Cuneiform. Maybe the script was designed around Sumerian words, but used by people who spoke several languages. Maybe some signs preserve terms borrowed from languages we can no longer identify. Maybe there were local languages underneath the written system. Languages spoken in homes, workshops, fields, and markets, leaving almost no direct trace because nobody wrote them down. This is not a fringe mystery. It is what happens whenever writing begins inside a complex society. The language of administration is not always the language of everyone being administered. Latin was used across medieval Europe by people who did not speak Latin at home. Imperial records can survive in one language, while the voices of ordinary people vanish in dozens of others. A state can count workers, record taxes, and distribute rations using terms that are understood institutionally, even when the population itself is multilingual. Uruk may have been doing something similar more than 5,000 years ago. And there is another complication. Some proto-cuneiform signs may be understood well enough as categories, yet still resist a secure linguistic reading. We can recognize a vessel because later scribes classified vessels. We can identify a kind of livestock because it appears beside appropriate numerical systems and related signs. We can see that a tablet concerns labour, grain, textiles, or herds, but knowing what a sign points to is not always the same as knowing the word it encoded. You can understand that a modern symbol means hospital without knowing whether the person reading it says hospital, Krankenhaus, Hospital, or something else entirely. Meaning and language overlap. They are not identical. That is why the earliest tablets remain so difficult. They are not written in a completely unknown code, nor are they simply early Sumerian books waiting for someone to read them aloud. They stand in between. They are records from the moment when symbols were beginning to carry language, but had not yet been forced to carry enough of it for us to recover every voice behind them. We can often identify the world they organized. We can sometimes identify the words later scribes used for parts of that world. But we cannot always prove what the first scribes said. And that is why no translation can ever be as simple as replacing one ancient sign with one modern word. And that leads to the question people always ask. If scholars have had these tablets for more than 100 years, if they know they come from Uruk, if they can identify grain, sheep, workers, jars, and numbers, why can't they just finish translating them? Because most of these tablets were never written to be read like books. They were not stories with a beginning, middle, and end. They were not letters. They were not laws, prayers, royal speeches, or personal diaries. Those kinds of texts give a translator something to hold on to. Names appear in sentences. Verbs show what happened. Grammar reveals who gave, who received, who travelled, who died. The earliest tablets often give us none of that. They are records, labels, lists. A cluster of signs at the top may identify an institution, a category, or an official. Below it there may be rows of commodities and numerical notations. Grain, animals, containers, textiles, labour groups, totals. Useful information, absolutely. But useful to whom? Probably to a scribe who already knew the system, a person working inside a temple, storehouse, workshop, or household administration, someone who did not need the tablet to explain every relationship, because the relationship was obvious from the transaction taking place around them. Imagine finding a spreadsheet from an unfamiliar company 5,000 years in the future. You can recognize columns of numbers. You can guess that Q4, SKU, and RMA are important. Maybe you can work out that one column means quantity and another means cost. But unless you know the company's internal codes, its rules, its departments, and the event that produced the sheet, you may never know exactly what every row means. Proto-Cuneiform is like that, except the company is gone. The language is uncertain. The scribes are dead, and the explanatory manuals, if they ever existed, have almost entirely vanished. Some tablets are damaged. That sounds obvious, but with these records, a missing corner can destroy the entire logic of the document. A single sign at the beginning of a line might tell us whether the numbers that follow refer to sheep, wool, milk, rations, workers, or an entirely different category. One broken edge can turn a likely interpretation into a guess. Other tablets were impressed carelessly, worn down through handling, baked unevenly in ancient fires, or broken and reconstructed from fragments found decades apart. Sometimes a mark is visible, but not clear enough to identify with confidence. Is it one sign? Two signs? A damaged version of a familiar sign? Or a sign that appears nowhere else? And some signs really are unknown. Not unknown in the dramatic sense that nobody has ever looked at them. Specialists have catalogued thousands of early signs, compared their shapes, tracked where they appear, and studied the numerical systems around them. But a sign that occurs once, or only a few times, is incredibly hard to decode. Context is everything. If a sign appears hundreds of times beside sheep and herd totals, we can make progress. If it appears once on a broken tablet beside an unusual number and a symbol for a vessel, there may be no way to know whether it means a product, a person, a place, a job, a measurement, or something else entirely. Rare combinations are just as difficult. You may know sign A. You may know sign B, but a next to B can mean something more specific than either sign alone. Think about the difference between ice and cream. Each word is simple. Put them together, and the meaning changes. Ancient scribes did this constantly. They combined signs into categories and compound designations that made perfect sense within their own administrative world, but can be opaque to us. Then there is the missing context beyond the tablet itself. Where exactly was it found? Was it recovered from a temple precinct, a household, a workshop, a rubbish fill, or an archive disturbed by later construction? Was it stored with related documents? Was it part of a larger batch? Did it belong to an institution that controlled livestock, textiles, land, labour, or ritual offerings? For early excavations, the answers are not always clear. Some tablets were recovered when archaeological methods were less precise than they are today. Others entered museum collections through old excavations, incomplete records, or the antiquities market, separated from the rooms, buildings, and tablet groups that might have explained them. A tablet without context is not silent, but it is speaking with much of its sentence missing. Later cuneiform helps. It helps enormously. By later periods, scribes were writing fuller texts in Sumerian and Akkadian. They preserved sign lists, lexical lists, school exercises, administrative documents, hymns, contracts, and royal inscriptions. Those texts show how signs developed over time. They tell us that certain early forms probably became certain later signs. They give likely readings. They reveal long traditions of scribal classification. But later, cuneiform is a clue, not a time machine. A sign used around 2500 BCE may have descended from a Proto-Cuneiform sign used centuries earlier. That does not mean it had exactly the same value at the beginning. Meanings shift. Pronunciations change. A symbol that once represented a physical object can become a word, a syllable, a grammatical marker, or a conventional sign whose original picture no longer matters. And the earliest scribes may have used conventions that later scribes abandoned completely. This is one of the hardest things to understand about ancient writing. A sign does not equal one word. It may have multiple values. One sign might refer to an object in one context, a related word in another, and a sound value in another. Later cuneiform became famous for this. The same sign could be read in several ways depending on language, context, and scribal convention. But the reverse is also true. The same value can be written with several different signs. A single word may have alternate spellings. Different scribal traditions may prefer different forms. A sign may be chosen not because it is the only possible sign, but because it fits a professional convention, distinguishes one category from another, or preserves an older habit. So when a scholar identifies a possible reading, that is not always the end of the problem. It may only be the beginning. Does this sign mean grain? A type of grain? A measure of grain? A worker assigned to grain? A ration connected to grain? A storehouse category? The sign may be familiar, the function may still be unclear. That is why no one can translate the earliest tablets is not quite right. Scholars can read portions of many of them. They can identify numerical systems. They can recognize recurring categories. They can reconstruct administrative patterns. They can say with varying degrees of confidence that a tablet concerns barley allocations, livestock accounts, labour assignments, textiles containers, or institutional deliveries. In some cases, they can read much more than that. But a complete translation suggests complete sentences, complete grammar, and complete certainty. Many tablets simply do not preserve enough information to give us that. Not because the scholars failed, because the tablets were never designed to tell outsiders everything. They were tools of a living system, and we are standing outside that system, 5,000 years later, trying to reconstruct its rules from clay fragments. The remarkable thing is not that parts remain unread. The remarkable thing is that any of it can still be understood at all. And this is where the comparison with the Rosetta Stone becomes so important. When people hear that an ancient script is difficult to read, they imagine a single breakthrough waiting somewhere in the desert. A lost stone, a buried inscription, one dramatic object that lets somebody crack the code overnight. That is not how Proto-Cuneiform works. The Rosetta Stone helped because it carried essentially the same decree in 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic Egyptian, and Egyptian hieroglyphs. Scholars could read Greek that gave them a known message beside an unknown one. Names like Ptolemy became anchors. Repeated groups of signs could be compared. Step by step, Egyptian writing began to open. Cuneiform had its own version of that process much later. The Behistun inscription, carved on a cliff in ancient Iran, repeated a royal proclamation in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. Old Persian could be approached first because its writing system was relatively simple and because royal names were known from Greek sources. That inscription helped unlock the languages of Mesopotamia. But Proto-Cuneiform comes before all of that. There is no surviving Proto-Cuneiform tablet with a neat translation in a known language beside it. No ancient scribe left us a label saying, "This sign means sheep." No bilingual dictionary from the first generation of writing has appeared. No royal inscription explains the grammar because, in most cases, there may not even be grammar in the form we expect. Instead, scholars work indirectly. They begin with repetition. If the same sign appears again and again beside a certain numerical system, on tablets found in settings associated with animals, it may be connected to livestock. If another sign appears alongside grain measures, storage vessels, and distribution totals, it may belong to the world of serial accounting. If a combination occurs only on tablets that appear to track labour, then it may identify a type of worker, a work group, an institution, or a ration category. That sounds straightforward. It is not, because patterns can tell you that something matters without telling you exactly what it means. Imagine seeing the word department repeated across hundreds of office documents from a civilization you do not understand. You might know it identifies an important category, but does it mean a place? A group of people? A branch of administration? A process? You need more evidence before you can say. Proto-Cuneiform decipherment is built from thousands of these careful, limited steps. A sign is copied. Its shape is compared with other versions. Its position on the tablet is recorded. The numbers around it are studied. The commodities beside it are noted. Its archaeological context is examined, if that context is known. Then it is compared with later writing, later Sumerian texts, later cuneiform signs, school exercises, administrative records, and especially lexical lists, become bridges across time. These lists were ancient attempts to organize knowledge: trees, animals, vessels, professions, places, foods, raw materials, and titles. They do not give us a perfect translation key, but they preserve categories that may reach back into the same bureaucratic traditions that produced the earliest tablets. Sometimes a Proto-Cuneiform sign looks like the ancestor of a later sign. Sometimes the later sign has a known Sumerian reading. That gives scholars a possibility, not proof, a possibility. And that distinction matters, because a sign can survive while its meaning changes. A category can remain while the word for it changes. A scribal school can preserve an old sign because tradition demands it, long after ordinary people stop thinking of it as a picture of anything at all. If you enjoy mysteries where the evidence is real but the final answer remains just out of reach, you can get the channel's book about the 12 unexplained mysteries on the website. The link is in the description, because Proto-Cuneiform may be one of the greatest unexplained mysteries of all, not a lost secret hidden by accident, but an entire system that was never meant to explain itself to strangers. And no individual scholar can solve it alone. This work is slow, collaborative, sometimes almost painfully slow. Researchers catalogue signs across collections in Baghdad, Berlin, London, Paris, Philadelphia, and museums around the world. They compare drawings made a century ago with new high-resolution photographs. They re-examine tablets excavated decades apart. They track tiny differences in wedge direction, line order, and sign placement. One specialist may focus on numerical notations, another on seal impressions, another on the sequence from Proto-Cuneiform into later Uruk writing, another on the vocabulary of livestock, textiles, or grain. A proposed reading can take years to gain acceptance. It has to work not just on one tablet, but across many tablets. It has to fit the numbers. It has to fit the archaeological setting. It has to make sense beside related signs, and it has to survive the possibility that the sign was used differently in another archive. That is science at its most patient. Not a genius staring at a tablet and suddenly hearing the voice of the past. More like hundreds of people across generations assembling a shattered machine without ever having seen the whole machine running. Could one spectacular discovery change everything? Absolutely. A cache of tablets found in secure archaeological context could reveal which signs belong together. A tablet that paired Proto-Cuneiform with a later readable form might provide a major anchor. A long text containing recognizable names, places, or repeated transactions could clarify signs that are now uncertain. But even then, it would not solve every ambiguity. One bilingual text might explain one archive, one institution, one local convention. It would not automatically tell us how every sign functioned across centuries of experimentation. It would not restore broken tablets. It would not reveal meanings for signs used only once. And it would not turn administrative shorthand into complete sentences where complete sentences never existed. Today, computers are helping. Digital databases can gather tablets scattered across the world into a single searchable record. Researchers can compare sign forms at a scale no human could manage alone. Machine learning tools may flag visual similarities, identify repeated sequences, and help reconstruct fragments that once belonged together. Three-dimensional scans can reveal impressions too faint to see in old photographs. But a database is not a Rosetta Stone. A machine can find a pattern. It cannot automatically tell us whether that pattern means sheep, wool, a shepherd, a herd allocation, or a temple office responsible for all four. For that we still need context, and context leads to a revealing fact about these first records. Behind the grain totals, animal counts, and vessel lists, there are people. Thousands of people. Workers whose names were often not written down, but whose labour may be hiding in the numbers. Behind those numbers are people, not kings, not legendary heroes, not the figures who would later appear in hymns and royal inscriptions. Workers, people carrying baskets of barley, people herding sheep beyond the city walls, people spinning wool into thread, weaving cloth, hauling reeds, shaping mud bricks, cleaning vessels, brewing beer, tending fields and delivering goods into storehouses whose accounts were pressed into wet clay. The earliest tablets rarely let us meet these people face to face. They do not pause to describe what they feared. They do not record jokes, arguments, love affairs, illnesses, or the names of children waiting at home. In many cases, they do not even preserve a clear individual name. But the tablets may still preserve traces of entire working populations. A line of signs beside a number might represent a quantity of grain. Another may record beer. Another, wool or finished textiles. Another, animals moving into or out of an institution. And beside these goods may appear a category that scholars interpret as a group of workers, an occupation, a rank, a household, or an administrative unit. That distinction is crucial. A tablet may tell us that a certain amount of barley was issued, but issued to whom? A single labourer, a gang of field workers. A workshop? A household headed by somebody whose title we cannot yet read. The tablet often does not explain. It assumes its original reader already knew. That is the problem with bureaucracy. It is written for insiders. Imagine finding a modern spreadsheet with columns labelled only by abbreviations. You can see that money moved. You can see that somebody received something. You can see that totals were checked. But unless you understand the institution behind the spreadsheet, the human story remains partly hidden. Proto-Cuneiform tablets can feel exactly like that. Still, their silence is revealing. The sheer volume of accounting suggests that late fourth-millennium Uruk was coordinating labour on a scale earlier villages had rarely needed. Grain had to be measured. Herds had to be counted. Wool had to be tracked from animal to fibre to textile. Containers, tools, fields, and perhaps work teams had to be managed. Goods came in. Goods went out. Somebody had to make sure the totals matched. And this points toward a system of institutional redistribution. People worked or their households owed labour. Institutions gathered part of the resulting grain, animals, textiles, and other resources. Then those institutions distributed food, drink, raw materials, or finished goods back out again. Not necessarily equally, not necessarily voluntarily, and not necessarily through one simple system. Some workers may have received rations for labour. Others may have been attached to households. Some may have held specialised roles. Some may have been dependent labourers with little control over where they worked or what they received. The earliest tablets are too difficult and too compressed to let us reconstruct every arrangement with confidence. But grain and beer appear again and again for a reason. They were not just food, they were measurable. Barley could be stored, counted and divided into standard amounts. Beer could be prepared and issued in containers. A ration of grain or beer turned labour into something administrators could calculate. How much work could a group provide? How much food would that group require? How much barley must be brought in before the next season? The tablet did not need to know a worker's personality. It needed to know the number. That sounds cold, because it is cold. But it is also one of the first moments when human labour becomes visible at this scale in the archaeological record. Not visible as a story, visible as an organised force. A group of people becomes a total. A total becomes a line on clay. And a line on clay becomes evidence more than 5,000 years later that somebody was expected to show up, perform a task, and receive something in return. Textiles may reveal the same system from another angle. Cloth was one of the great products of ancient Mesopotamian institutions. Wool had to be gathered from animals, it had to be cleaned, spun, dyed in some cases, woven, stored and distributed. Every stage required skill, every stage required time, and every stage could be counted. Later, Mesopotamian archives make this world clearer. They record large textile workshops, teams of spinners and weavers, supervisors, rations, quotas and deliveries. We cannot simply project every later detail backward onto the first tablets. That would be a mistake. But the Proto-Cuneiform evidence suggests that the foundations were already being laid. The first writing may have emerged not because someone wanted to write poetry, but because too many goods, workers and obligations were moving through a growing institution to keep track of in the human mind alone. Animals tell a similar story. A herd is wealth, but it is also work. Sheep produce wool, goats produce milk. Cattle can pull loads and work fields. Animals reproduce, die, are slaughtered, traded, offered, lost, and counted again. A tablet that tracks livestock is not merely recording creatures. It may be recording the labour of herders, feeders, drovers, butchers, textile workers, and officials responsible for the herd. One animal category can imply an entire chain of human activity. And then there are the titles. Some signs seem to identify roles rather than things. They may refer to officials, supervisors, specialists, or groups defined by occupation. Later Mesopotamian writing preserves a rich world of professional categories: herders, fishermen, brewers, cooks, gardeners, boatmen, potters, metalworkers, scribes, and many more. In the earliest tablets, some of these categories may already be present, but often we cannot be certain whether a sign names a person, a job, a department, or an institution. That uncertainty is frustrating. It is also honest. Because these documents illuminate systems more clearly than lives. They can show us that labour was organised. They can suggest hierarchy. They can reveal that some people counted goods while others produced them, that some received allocations while others authorised them, that some categories had greater administrative importance than others, but they usually do not tell us what it felt like to be on the lower end of that hierarchy. Was a grain ration enough? Was the work seasonal or constant? Could a worker refuse? Did people move between jobs? Were families protected by these institutions, controlled by them, or both? The clay is almost silent, so we have an ethical choice in how we read it. We can look at a tablet and see only 30 workers, 200 measures of barley, 12 sheep, and a total checked by a scribe. Or we can remember that every number stood for bodies. Hands sore from weaving, backs strained from carrying loads, families depending on a harvest. People whose labour made the city possible, even when the written record reduced them to categories. And that raises the next question. Who had the power to turn all of that labour into an account? Who controlled the storehouses, the rations, the herds, and the scribes who recorded them? Because the earliest writing was not floating freely through society. It was concentrated in places where goods, authority, and belief came together: temples, storehouses, and the institutions that were learning how to rule through records. Those places were probably not separate. In late fourth-millennium Uruk, a religious precinct was not necessarily just a place where people came to pray. It could be a complex economic institution, a place with workshops, storerooms, kitchens, animal pens, fields, officials, dependent workers, and enough incoming and outgoing goods to make memory alone impossible. This is one reason temples matter so much in the story of writing. The earliest tablets have been found in areas associated with major monumental precincts, especially the Iana district at Uruk. Iana was later linked to the goddess Inanna. though we should be careful about projecting later religious arrangements directly backward onto the first tablets. The buildings changed over centuries. The meanings of the spaces may have changed too, and an administrative tablet found near a temple does not automatically prove that priests controlled every transaction recorded on it. But the pattern is hard to ignore. The biggest early archives appear where architecture, storage, labour, ritual and prestige were already concentrated. These were places capable of gathering resources from beyond a single household. Grain from fields, animals from herders, wool from flocks. Fish, reeds, timber, ceramics, textiles, perhaps metals and stone, brought from far away through trade networks. Once these resources entered an institution, they had to be sorted. And the moment goods are sorted, measured, and recorded, something deeper begins to happen. Because accounting does not merely describe reality, it helps create it. Take a field worker bringing barley to a storehouse. Before the grain is counted, there is grain. There is a person. There may be an agreement, a custom, an obligation, a gift, a tax-like payment, a religious offering, or a share owed to whoever controlled the land. But once an official measures that barley and presses the amount into clay, the transaction becomes something else. It becomes an official fact. This much came in. This much is now held. This much must go out. This person, household work group, or department is associated with this amount. And if the tablet says a certain amount is owed, then the institution has created a claim that can outlast the memory of everyone standing in the room. That is power. Not power in the later sense of a king issuing laws across a vast empire. Uruk was not yet Babylon. It was not Assyria. We should not imagine a fully formed centralized state with ministries, police forces, and a single ruler controlling every corner of society. The evidence does not allow that. Early Mesopotamia may have contained overlapping institutions, powerful households, neighborhood communities, craft groups, local leaders, temple personnel, and networks of exchange operating alongside one another. Some tablets may record temple administration. Others may belong to storehouse systems, elite households, workshops, or institutions whose exact nature has disappeared with the people who ran them. But wherever writing was used, it gave certain people an extraordinary advantage. The people who controlled the measures controlled what counted as a measure. The people who defined categories controlled how people and goods appeared in the official world. Was a group listed as independent producers, workers receiving rations, dependents of a household, temple personnel, or simply a number attached to a commodity. That classification could shape who received food, who owed labour, who could claim a share, and who disappeared into a total. A tablet looks neutral. Clay does not look political. But every account depends on decisions. Which goods deserve recording? Which losses count? Which deliveries are accepted? Which workers receive rations? Who is named? Who is reduced to a category? Who has access to the tablet once it is stored away? Those decisions turn administration into authority. And temples were especially powerful places for that authority to grow, because religion could make economic control meaningful in ways raw force could not. If grain entered a sacred precinct, it might not be understood as mere extraction. It could be an offering to a god, support for a ritual household, a contribution to a community institution, or part of an order believed to connect human work with divine stability. The god needed offerings. The sanctuary needed upkeep. Festivals needed food, drink, animals, textiles, vessels, and labour. Workers who served the institution might receive rations not simply from an official, but from the household of a deity. That idea could be profoundly powerful. A storehouse was no longer just a building full of barley. It became part of a sacred and social order. The people managing it could present themselves not merely as wealthy individuals, but as caretakers of the gods, protectors of abundance, organizers of collective survival. And in a world where harvests could fail, rivers could shift, and famine was never far away, access to stored grain mattered more than almost anything. Control the storehouse, and you can feed people during a bad season. Control the rations, and you can reward loyalty. Control the herds, workshops, and land, and you can direct labour toward projects too large for individual families: walls, canals, monumental buildings, long-distance trade, ritual feasts. Control the records, and you can make those arrangements durable. This does not mean every worker was simply oppressed, or every institution was a machine for exploitation. Large-scale storage and redistribution could provide real security. Communities may have benefited from pooled resources. Specialized workers may have depended on institutional rations because they were producing goods others needed. Temples may have coordinated festivals, repairs, irrigation, and aid in ways that bound communities together. But systems that provide security can also create dependence. If your food comes through an institution, the institution can decide the terms. If your labour is measured by somebody else can define what counts as enough. If you cannot read the tablet that records your obligation, while a trained scribe can, then knowledge itself becomes unevenly distributed. That may be one of writing's earliest social consequences. The first writers did not just preserve information. They helped create a world in which information could be controlled. A world where a small group of administrators could see flows of grain, labour, animals and textiles across an entire institution, while the people producing those things saw only their own task, their own ration, their own immediate obligation. The tablet gave power a memory, and once power has a memory, it can compare this year to last year. It can identify shortages, demand arrears, calculate surplus, plan larger projects, decide who gets more and who gets less. It can turn an unequal relationship into a routine. But there was still a problem. To manage an expanding world, administrators needed more than lists of barley and sheep. They needed categories for everything: plants, animals, objects, professions, places, measures, perhaps even the entire structure of the world they believed they inhabited. And that is exactly what some of the strangest early tablets appear to be trying to create. And this is where the tablets become stranger. Some of the earliest written documents are not accounts in the simple sense. They do not appear to record one delivery of grain, one herd of sheep, or one group of workers receiving rations. Instead, they are lists. Lists of officials, lists of occupations, lists of places, lists of animals, lists of fish, birds, trees, vessels, containers, textiles, tools, and different kinds of food, one sign after another, arranged in sequences that seem designed not to describe a single event, but to organize an entire category of reality. At first glance, that might sound boring. A list of jars is not exactly an epic poem. But these tablets may reveal something enormous, because somebody in Uruk had begun looking at the world and asking a very unusual question. Not what happened today, but what kinds of things exist? What kinds of people work here? What kinds of animals can be counted? What kinds of containers hold grain, beer, oil, or wool? What places belong to this institution? What titles mark someone's role? What is the proper sign for each one? That is not just writing. That is classification. Imagine walking through a late fourth-millennium city. There are fields outside the walls, herds moving through the landscape, fishermen on canals, reed cutters, potters, weavers, boat builders, labourers, guards, cooks, brewers, herders, messengers, administrators, ritual specialists. There are baskets, jars, bowls, storage bins, tools, textiles, animals, plants, and raw materials arriving from distant places. To the people living there, this world was probably full of motion, noise, obligation, and confusion. But on a lexical tablet, it can be broken apart. The animals go here. The vessels go there. The professions belong in another sequence. The places have their own signs. A chaotic living world is turned into columns, categories, and repeatable order. And once you can do that, an institution becomes easier to manage. If you have a standard list of vessel types, an administrator can distinguish a large storage jar from a small pouring vessel. If you have recognized categories of workers, you can assign rations, labor, status, and responsibilities. If different animals have distinct signs, you can track what is coming in, what is breeding, what is being slaughtered, and what is owed. The list does not merely help someone remember reality. It tells them how reality should be divided. That difference matters. Because categories are never completely natural. A sheep is a sheep. But an institution may care whether it is male or female, young or old, alive or slaughtered, part of a herd, an offering, a ration, or a product measured in wool. A person is a person, but a tablet may reduce them to a profession, a work group, a title, a number, or no identifiable category at all. The list creates an official version of the world, and that version can be incredibly powerful. Now, what exactly were these lists for? That is harder to answer. Some scholars think they were teaching tools. A beginning scribe may have learned signs the way a modern student learns vocabulary, profession after profession, animal after animal, vessel after vessel, repeating standard sequences until the signs became familiar. That makes sense. Writing was difficult. It required learning not only how to press marks into clay, but how to recognize hundreds of signs, how to distinguish similar forms, how to understand numerical systems, and how to place information in the format an institution expected. A lexical list could be a textbook, but it may also have been an administrative reference, a practical guide for officials who needed consistent names and categories across many transactions. If one tablet calls a container by one sign, and another tablet uses a different sign for the same thing, records become harder to compare. Standard lists could help create a shared bureaucratic language, and perhaps they were more than either of those things. Teaching, administration, and classification may have been inseparable. A student learning the signs was learning the institution's worldview. They were learning that this animal belonged in this category, this worker belonged under this title, this container had this recognized value, this place had this official name. To become literate was not just to learn how to write. It was to learn how the system saw. This is why lexical lists are so important to modern scholars. The earliest Proto-Cuneiform tablets are often frustratingly opaque. A sign may appear in an account, but without a bilingual translation, without a sentence explaining its meaning, and without enough surviving context to make the answer obvious. But if that same sign appears in a list of animals, its likely meaning narrows. If it appears between signs already identified as types of vessels, then it may also be a vessel. If a repeated sequence turns up across multiple tablets, scholars can begin reconstructing the categories scribes used. The lists are not a Rosetta Stone. They do not suddenly tell us what every sign means. But they are clues left by the scribes themselves, tiny maps of a lost intellectual system. And sometimes they preserve something even more surprising. Not the sound of spoken language, but the structure of knowledge before language was fully pinned down in writing. A sign could identify a thing, an office, a place, or an idea, without necessarily recording a complete spoken word the way later cuneiform often would. The list could function almost like a catalogue of concepts, not a sentence saying, bring 3 jars of oil to the storehouse, but a framework that says, these are the kinds of jars that exist. These are the distinctions that matter. In that sense, the lexical lists may be among humanity's first attempts to make the world legible. To take an environment too large for any one person to hold in their head and compress it into an ordered archive. Not the world as it truly was in all its messiness. The world as an institution needed to see it. And once scribes could classify the world, they could begin doing something even more ambitious. They could attach those categories to grammar, sound, and speech. They could move from signs that organize things to writing that could capture words. But that change did not happen overnight. There was no morning when a scribe walked into an Uruk storehouse, looked down at a wet clay tablet, and announced that writing had been invented. No single genius carved the first perfect sentence. No clean line separates a world without readable writing from a world with it. Instead, there were generations of scribes making small adjustments. A sign becomes easier to press. A numerical notation becomes more regular. A picture becomes less like a picture. A symbol once used mainly to identify an object begins to stand for the sound of a spoken word. Then that sound can be used to write another word that sounds similar. Little by little, the system becomes more flexible, and eventually it becomes something we can recognize as cuneiform. The earliest Proto-Cuneiform signs from late fourth-millennium Uruk often look surprisingly pictorial. A fish can resemble a fish. A jar may still suggest the outline of a jar. A human head, a plant, an animal, a tool, some signs seem to preserve a visual memory of the things they represented. But even at the beginning, these were not simply drawings. A picture on a tablet was being reduced, repeated, standardized, and placed into an administrative system. It had to be fast enough to write, clear enough for trained readers to recognize, and stable enough that different officials could use it in similar ways. That pressure changed the signs. Imagine trying to draw hundreds of tiny fish, jars, sheep, fields, workers, and containers into damp clay all day. Fine lines blur, curves collapse, details disappear. And a busy scribe does not need an artistic fish. They need a mark that another scribe will recognize as fish. So the signs began to simplify. At first, scribes could make lines by dragging a pointed tool through the clay. But over time, they increasingly used a stylus with a cut, often reed-made tip. Instead of drawing long flowing shapes, they pressed the stylus into the surface. Each press left a triangular impression, a wedge. The Latin word for wedge is cuneus. That is where the name cuneiform comes from, wedge-shaped writing. This was not just a change in appearance. It changed the entire physical logic of the script. A sign that might once have looked like a little picture could now be built from combinations of wedges, vertical wedges, horizontal wedges, angled wedges, clusters of marks arranged in a standard pattern. The old visual connection to an object became weaker and weaker. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, many signs that had once been recognizably pictorial had become abstract enough that you would never guess their original image without being taught. And that was probably the point. The sign no longer needed to resemble a sheep. It needed to function as sheep, or perhaps as the Sumerian word for sheep, or as a sound associated with that word, or as one part of a larger written expression whose meaning depended on context. That last step was the revolution. Proto-Cuneiform could identify things, quantities, people, offices, and categories with astonishing precision. But its ability to capture full spoken language was limited, or at least far less visible to us. The earliest tablets rarely give us the kind of grammatical clues that make later texts readable. Verb forms, particles, pronouns, complete sentences, and clear syntax. Then scribes discovered gradually that signs could do more than point at things. They could point at sounds. This is called phonetic writing. And once a sign can represent a spoken syllable rather than only an object or idea, the possibilities expand dramatically. A sign associated with a word could be borrowed for the sound of that word, then used to write another word with the same or a similar sound. It is the same basic principle behind a rebus puzzle. If you want to write the sound B, you might draw a B, even if you're actually talking about the letter B. That may sound like a small trick. It was not. It meant scribes could begin writing names that had no obvious picture. They could represent grammatical endings. They could distinguish actions from objects. They could record ownership, relationships, commands, agreements, prayers, insults, and eventually stories. Writing was no longer confined to the inventory of a storehouse. It could begin following speech, not perfectly, not all at once, and not in the easy alphabetic way modern readers might imagine. Cuneiform remained a complicated mixture. One sign could function as a word sign, a syllable, a classifier, or a clue to meaning. The same sign could have multiple readings. Different scribal traditions could favour different conventions. But the system had crossed a threshold. It could now say more. This becomes increasingly clear in the early dynastic period, roughly the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. The surviving texts from this era are richer than the old Proto-Cuneiform archives. We find more names, more titles, more legal and economic records, dedicatory inscriptions, administrative documents that contain clearer grammatical structure. Some of the earliest royal inscriptions begin to appear, short statements identifying rulers, temples, victories, construction projects, and offerings to gods. For the first time, the written record starts giving us flashes of individual voices and political ambition. A ruler can declare that he built a temple. An official can identify himself by name. A tablet can record not merely goods, but obligations between people. The bureaucracy is still there. Grain is still measured. Livestock is still counted. Labour is still organised. But now, the text can reach beyond the warehouse. It can make claims. It can preserve identity. It can tell somebody, somewhere in the future, this happened. This belonged to me. This was given to a god. This person held this office. And yet, even these early dynastic texts are not effortlessly transparent. Sumerian itself is a language isolate. It has no demonstrably close living relatives. Its grammar can be reconstructed in substantial detail from later texts, bilingual lists, and centuries of scribal tradition, but many early forms remain uncertain. Signs shift in value over time. Local writing habits differ. Tablets can be damaged. A single word may have several possible readings. And administrative shorthand still leaves out everything a modern reader wants to know. Who exactly was this worker? Why was this grain issued? What happened before this delivery? What did the people whose names never appear think about any of it? The tablets often do not say. So the journey from Proto-Cuneiform to Readable cuneiform was not a sudden emergence from silence into clarity. It was more like watching a language come into focus through fog. At first we see categories, numbers, objects, and institutional needs. Then the signs harden into wedges. Their pictorial origins fade. Their forms become teachable, repeatable, portable. Then sound enters the system more fully. Then grammar. Then names. Then, slowly, the possibility that writing can hold not just an account of the world, but a statement about it. And that is when the clay tablets begin to do something their earliest creators may never have imagined. They begin to tell stories, but not immediately in the way we might expect. The first stories were not necessarily written down the moment writing became capable of carrying them. Human beings had been telling stories for far longer than they had been pressing wedges into clay, around fires, during rituals, at funerals, in fields, workshops, palaces, and temple courtyards. Stories about ancestors, dangerous rivers, great kings, jealous gods, the first cities, the first flood, the first time somebody broke a rule and paid for it. Writing did not invent storytelling, it captured some of it. And when it finally did, the change was enormous. The earliest Uruk tablets are mostly administrative. They care about sheep, barley, beer, labour, land, containers, textiles, deliveries and rations. They tell us that institutions were measuring the world, sorting it, counting it, turning people and resources into categories that could be managed. They do not usually pause to tell us how someone felt about any of it. No worker writes, "I am tired." No farmer writes, "The river failed us this year." No child writes down a frightening story about the gods. That silence can feel strange. The first surviving writing from one of the world's first great cities is not a diary. It is not a poem. It is not a confession or a love letter. It is paperwork, and that is probably not because the people of Uruk lacked imagination. It is because institutions had the strongest reason to preserve writing in the first place. A temple needed to know what entered its storehouses. A palace, or whatever early governing authority existed, needed to track workers and goods. Managers needed records that could outlast memory. Scribes were trained not simply to express themselves, but to make the machinery of a large society function. Clay was used because it was cheap and durable, but the tablets that survived were also the kinds of documents institutions created in enormous numbers. The personal voices may have existed in speech, song, and performance. They may have been carved onto wood, written on perishable materials, or never written at all. Those voices mostly vanished. The bureaucratic tablets did not. Then, over the following centuries, the written world begins to widen. Scribes start producing hymns to gods, temple songs, ritual instructions, incantations intended to protect against illness, demons, and misfortune. Royal inscriptions proclaiming that a ruler built a sanctuary, defeated an enemy, dug a canal, or brought offerings before a deity. At first, many royal inscriptions are brief, almost brutally brief. A king's name, his title, the god he serves, the temple he built. But even that is something new. A tablet or stone object is no longer only recording a transaction. It is making a claim across time. It is telling future readers who held power, which gods supported that power, and what the ruler wanted remembered. Then come proverbs. Short, sharp observations about human behaviour. Warnings about foolishness, complaints about bad decisions, little verbal traps that sound almost modern. People boasting too much, children misbehaving, officials abusing authority, friends proving unreliable. Proverbs are important because they show writing reaching into ordinary social experience. Not just grain and kings, not just gods and temples. They preserve the dry humour, anxieties, and accumulated suspicion of people who had watched other people make the same mistakes for generations. And then there are narratives, stories with characters, conflict, speeches, journeys, victories, losses, and endings. The most famous later example is Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk who becomes a figure of impossible strength, dangerous pride, friendship, grief, and the search for life beyond death. But the Gilgamesh story, as most people know, it comes much later than the earliest tablets. Its best-known version was assembled in the first millennium BCE, more than 2,000 years after Proto-Cuneiform appeared. Earlier Sumerian compositions preserve separate stories about Gilgamesh, his battles, his journeys, his confrontation with death, his relationship with kings and gods. These texts are ancient, but they are still much later than the first administrative tablets of Uruk. That distinction matters. It is tempting to look at an early unreadable sign from around 3300 BCE and imagine that it must conceal Gilgamesh, the flood, creation, or some lost epic from a vanished civilization. Maybe some early signs refer to traditions we can no longer recover. That is possible, but the evidence does not let us place later myths directly onto those earliest marks. A sign for a god is not automatically a creation story. A sign for a king is not automatically a lost dynasty. A sign associated with water is not automatically the flood. The earliest tablets are fragments of an administrative system, and they have to be read on their own terms. Later literature can help us understand the world that eventually grew around writing. It cannot simply be used as a decoder ring for every mysterious mark at Uruk. Still, later texts may preserve traditions much older than the tablets on which they survive. A hymn copied in a scribal school around 1800 BCE could contain phrases, divine names, ritual patterns, or stories passed down orally for centuries. A king list written long after early dynasties may preserve dim memories of real political change, mixed with legend, propaganda, and impossible reign lengths. A flood narrative may echo experiences of devastating river floods, even if it is not a literal record of one single world-ending event. This is the strange power of ancient literature. It can be younger than the events or traditions it describes, yet older than almost everything else we have. The clay tablet becomes a bridge. On one side is a living voice, a singer, priest, storyteller, ruler or teacher speaking to people in a particular place. On the other side is us, but bridges distort things. They preserve some details and lose others. A story copied by generations of scribes may be edited, standardized, expanded, shortened, moralized, or reshaped for a new political and religious world. What reaches us is not the untouched voice of the distant past. It is the past remembered, and that may be why the first written voice sounds so impersonal. Writing began as a tool for institutions because institutions could afford scribes, archives, and storage. The people whose lives filled those records were counted before they were heard. First came the ration, then the name, then the claim, then the prayer, then, eventually, the story. And once writing could carry stories, it could carry something even more powerful. The idea that the world before human beings was not empty. It was already organized, already ruled, already claimed by the gods. Later Mesopotamian texts describe a universe that begins not with random chaos, but with forces being separated, named, assigned their places. Heaven above, earth below, fresh water beneath the ground. Salt water beyond the land, rivers, reeds, animals, storms, stars, and seasons. Everything had a place because everything had been given one. For the people of ancient Mesopotamia, order was not automatic. It had to be maintained. The river could flood too high, or fail completely. Canals could silt up. Fields could turn white with salt. A city could prosper for generations and then be abandoned. Disease, war, drought, and famine were never far away. So the cosmos itself was imagined as something structured but fragile, a system held together by divine authority, ritual obligation, and human labour. The gods made the world intelligible, and human beings had a job inside it. In some Mesopotamian traditions, people are created so the gods do not have to do all the work themselves. Humans cultivate fields, raise animals, build temples, prepare offerings, and maintain the sacred order. That might sound harsh to us. humanity as a workforce for the gods. But it also gave ordinary labour cosmic meaning. Planting barley was not just planting barley, it was participating in the structure of the universe. Cleaning a canal, delivering animals, brewing beer for a temple, recording rations on a tablet. These were not necessarily separate from religion. They were part of the same world. The world of the gods and the world of administration overlapped. And that helps explain why the earliest writing begins with accounts. To a modern reader, a tablet listing grain and workers can seem painfully ordinary. But in Mesopotamia, measuring grain, organizing labor, and supplying a temple may have been connected to the deepest possible question. How does the world remain in order? Later myths also look backward toward ancient cities. Not cities as accidental collections of houses, but cities as places established under divine protection. Eridu, often associated with the god Enki, was remembered as an exceptionally ancient sacred place. Nippur belonged to Enlil, a god of enormous authority. Uruk was linked with Inanna and, later, with Gilgamesh. Other cities had their own gods, their own temples, their own claims to antiquity. A city was not simply where people happened to live. It was a point where heaven and earth met. Its temple was the house of its god. Its ruler governed, at least in theory, with divine approval. Its walls marked out a protected human space against the wilderness beyond. This is where divine kingship enters the picture. Mesopotamian kings did not always claim to be gods themselves. That varied across periods and rulers, but they consistently presented kingship as something granted by the gods. A ruler was supposed to build temples, defend the land, judge disputes, maintain canals, feed the gods and preserve order. When a king won, the gods had favoured him. When a city fell, perhaps its god had abandoned it. Or perhaps the people had failed in their duties. Or perhaps a greater divine decision had been made somewhere beyond human understanding. That way of seeing history is very different from modern history. We tend to ask about armies, trade routes, crop failures, political alliances, and technological change. Mesopotamian writers could notice all of those things, but they also understood events through divine intention. A kingdom did not merely collapse. The balance of the cosmos had shifted. And here is where things get complicated. These stories were written down centuries, sometimes millennia, after the first tablets at Uruk. The people who copied creation stories, king lists, hymns, and flood narratives were not looking at a perfect archive of deep prehistory. They were inheriting traditions. Some may have been passed down orally for a very long time. Some may preserve real memories of ancient cities, changing landscapes, migrations, wars, or devastating floods. But memory is not the same thing as a record. A story can preserve a truth without preserving literal facts. A tradition that says kingship descended from heaven tells us something real about how Mesopotamians understood political authority. It does not prove that a physical object called kingship fell from the sky. A story that describes the first city tells us something real about the importance of urban life, temples, and divine patronage. It does not necessarily identify the first city ever built. A flood story may preserve the memory of real catastrophic flooding in southern Mesopotamia, where rivers could transform entire landscapes. But it does not automatically become evidence for one single flood that covered the whole world. This distinction matters because ancient origin stories are incredibly seductive. They promise access to the beginning, the first king, the first city, the first law, the first disaster. The lost age before history became history, and modern audiences are especially vulnerable to that promise. We look at texts from 5,000 years ago and feel that they must contain forbidden knowledge, a secret map of civilization. a memory of an older world destroyed before writing began. Sometimes that desire turns into speculation. What if the Sumerians remembered a lost advanced civilization? What if their gods were descriptions of real beings? What if the broken signs on the earliest tablets conceal a history no one wants us to know? But the more interesting answer is also the more difficult one. The Sumerians did not need a hidden civilization to make their stories powerful. They lived in one of humanity's earliest urban worlds. They saw cities rise from mud brick plains. They watched rivers create life and erase it. They inherited ruins older than their grandparents' grandparents could imagine. They knew that the world had existed before them, and that it would continue after them. Their myths gave that feeling a shape, not a scientific account of the planet's origins, not a documentary record of prehistory, something else, a cultural memory of beginnings, a religious explanation for why cities mattered, why kings ruled, why people worked, why disasters happened, and why order always seemed one flood, one war, one failed harvest away from collapse. And among all those memories of beginnings, one story would become impossible to ignore. The story that said the world itself had once been washed away. The story that said the world itself had once been washed away. In Mesopotamia, that story did not exist on its own. It was connected to kingship, and one of the strangest documents ever written makes that connection explicit. It is called the Sumerian King List. At first glance, it looks almost modern. A sequence of cities, a sequence of rulers, names, dynasties, reign lengths, places where political power supposedly moved from one city to another. It appears to be trying to answer a very simple question. Who ruled first? But then you reach the beginning. The King List says that after kingship descended from heaven, it was established in Eridu. There the first rulers reigned for astonishing lengths of time. Not 40 years, not 80 years, not even a few centuries. Tens of thousands of years. In some versions, 8 kings rule before the flood, for a combined total of 241,200 years. One ruler governs for 28,800 years, another for 36,000. Then comes the catastrophe. The flood sweeps over the land, and afterward the text says, kingship descends from heaven again, this time settling in a new city. Kish. It is an extraordinary claim. A list that begins in the world before the flood, passes through disaster, and then continues into rulers and cities that are historically much more recognizable. And this is exactly why it has fascinated people for generations. Because the King List seems to stand with one foot in myth and one foot in history. Later parts include dynasties that correspond, at least broadly, to real Mesopotamian cities and rulers. Archaeology confirms that places like Kish, Uruk, Lagash and Akkad were major centres of power. Some kings named in later sections are independently attested by inscriptions. Others remain uncertain, but the list is not pure invention in the sense of a fantasy novel. It is also not a reliable chronology in the modern sense. That distinction is everything. Those impossible reign lengths are not a secret calendar waiting for somebody to decode it correctly. They are part of the text's message. Before the flood, time itself was different. Kings were closer to the divine order. The world belonged to an age beyond ordinary human measure. Then the flood broke that age apart. This pattern appears across Mesopotamian literature. In the Sumerian flood story, often called the Eridu Genesis, the gods decide to destroy humanity. A man named Ziusudra receives warning and survives in a great boat. In the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, the survivor is Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, he becomes Utnapishtim, the man who lived through the flood and was granted a form of immortality beyond the human world. The details shift from story to story. The names change. The reasons for the flood change. In one account, humanity has become too noisy for the gods. In another, divine decisions are more mysterious, but the basic structure remains. The gods send disaster. One righteous or favoured man is warned. A vessel preserves life. The flood destroys the old world. And afterward, humanity begins again under new conditions. Centuries later, flood traditions in the Hebrew Bible would take shape in the broader cultural world of the ancient Near East. The story of Noah is not simply a copy of the Mesopotamian versions. It has its own theology, its own purpose, its own powerful differences. But the resemblance is too strong to ignore. A divinely sent flood. A chosen survivor. A boat. Animals preserved. Birds sent out over the waters. A new beginning after destruction. These stories belong to a conversation that crossed languages, kingdoms, and thousands of years. But here comes the temptation. If Mesopotamian texts remember a flood before recorded kings, maybe they are describing a real global catastrophe. Maybe the huge rain lengths are distorted memories of a lost civilization. Maybe the antediluvian kings were not mythic at all, but rulers from an age modern archaeology has failed to find. It is a compelling idea, and it goes far beyond the evidence. Southern Mesopotamia was one of the most flood-prone places on Earth. The Tigris and Euphrates did not flow through stable, predictable channels. They shifted. They overflowed. They deposited silt over settlements. A severe regional flood could destroy crops, drown livestock, collapse mud brick houses, and erase entire communities from the visible landscape. For people living there, a flood did not have to cover the whole planet to feel like the end of the world. Archaeologists have found flood deposits at several ancient Mesopotamian sites, including Kish, and Shuruppak. For a time, these discoveries were treated as possible evidence for one enormous event. But the layers do not line up neatly. They date to different periods. They occur at different depths. They likely reflect multiple local or regional floods across centuries and millennia. That does not prove that flood stories were invented from nothing. It means the archaeological evidence fits a more complicated reality. Mesopotamia experienced many devastating floods. Oral memory may have preserved the emotional force of such disasters. Later writers may have gathered those memories into one overwhelming event, a flood large enough to divide time itself into before and after. That is what myth can do. It can compress generations of disaster into one story. It can turn a dangerous river system into a cosmic judgment. It can take a real experience, survival after catastrophe, and give it meaning. And the king list does something equally important with political memory. It does not merely report who ruled, it constructs a theory of rule. Kingship belongs to the gods. It appears in one city, then moves to another. When a dynasty falls, this is not just because an army lost a battle or a canal failed. Power has been transferred. The list turns political change into sacred history. That was useful, very useful. A ruler or city could claim legitimacy by placing itself inside this ancient chain. We are not just powerful, the text implies. We are the latest holders of kingship that descended from heaven before the flood. So myth and history were not accidentally mixed together. They were deliberately woven together. The cities were real. Some kings were real. Wars, succession, struggles, conquests, and collapses were real. But the arrangement of those facts served a larger claim that the political order of the present was rooted in the structure of the universe. And once you see that, the king list becomes more interesting than a failed timeline. It becomes a map of how ancient Mesopotamians imagined time itself. Not as a straight line of dates, but as a fragile inheritance carried across catastrophe from the first city through the flood, into the kingdoms that still wanted to rule the world. And that brings us to one of the biggest questions surrounding the earliest writing on Earth. What if the tablets are only the surviving edge of something much older? What if the signs we cannot read are not just administrative labels, but fragments from a civilization whose real achievements, stories, and knowledge have vanished? A civilization that existed before Sumer, before Uruk, maybe even before the flood traditions themselves. This is where the mystery gets dangerous, because the earliest tablets are incomplete. Their signs are difficult. Their language is uncertain. Their context is often broken. Many were excavated from damaged layers, mixed deposits, or buildings destroyed and rebuilt so many times that the original order is hard to reconstruct. And wherever there are gaps, speculation rushes in. Some people look at the undeciphered signs from Uruk and see evidence of forgotten advanced technology. Others argue that the strange images, unusual numerical systems, and references to gods descending from heaven preserve memories of visitors from another world. Still others believe the tablets conceal proof of a vanished global civilization destroyed by the flood, leaving Mesopotamia as the last surviving branch of a far older human world. It's an incredible idea, and it has one thing going for it. The world of Uruk really was incredible. Around 5,000 years ago, southern Mesopotamia saw changes on a scale no earlier society had achieved. Uruk grew into what may have been the world's first true city. Tens of thousands of people may have lived there at its height. It had monumental temple complexes, workshops, storage facilities, massive mud brick construction projects, long-distance trade, specialized labor, and administrators trying to track goods moving through an economy too large to manage by memory alone. That is not primitive. It is not a handful of farmers making random scratches in clay. It was a complex urban society coordinating grain, animals, textiles, labor, land, and religious institutions across a city and its surrounding countryside. The earliest writing emerged from that pressure, when too many people, too many goods, and too many obligations are moving through the same system. Somebody needs a way to keep score. Clay became the answer. But remarkable does not mean inexplicable. Uruk did not appear from nowhere, fully formed, with secret knowledge beyond its time. Archaeology shows a long build-up, for centuries before writing. Communities in Mesopotamia had been farming, irrigating fields, raising animals, building temples, making pottery, exchanging goods, and developing systems of authority. Tokens had been used to track commodities. Seals had marked ownership and control. Settlements had grown larger. Institutions had become more powerful. Writing was revolutionary, but it had a history. The first tablets do not read like messages from a technologically advanced lost world. Most appear to concern things we would expect an emerging city to care about: grain rations, beer, sheep, labourers, land, containers, textiles, and institutional deliveries. They are frustrating because they preserve only pieces of the system. A sign may identify an official, a place, a commodity, a title, or a category we no longer understand. But the tablets themselves fit the world archaeologists find around them. Storehouses, workshops, temples, fields, animals, people being counted. That doesn't make them less mysterious. In some ways, it makes them more mysterious. Because these are not royal monuments designed to survive forever. They are the everyday paperwork of a world that has mostly disappeared. And paperwork can reveal things grand myths leave out. Who received rations? Who worked in the fields? What the temple controlled? Which materials were rare? How many sheep came in, and how much wool went out? The problem is that we do not have the whole archive. Imagine trying to reconstruct a modern city from a few damaged spreadsheets, a shipping label, half a tax form, and a list of employee names, all written in a language nobody can fully identify. You might discover that food was distributed, workers were organized, and goods were moved between departments. But you would not know the private conversations, the political arguments, the songs people sang, the inventions they tried, the disasters they remembered, or the stories they told their children. That is the real loss. Not necessarily a lost super-civilization with impossible machines. A lost human civilization in the truest sense. A world of voices, ideas, conflicts, beliefs, and experiences that once existed in full detail, then was reduced to a few marks pressed into mud. And yes, there are unanswered questions. We still cannot read every Proto-Cuneiform sign with confidence. We do not know precisely how the earliest writing system sounded when spoken. We do not know how much was written on perishable materials like wood, wax, leather, reeds, or cloth. We do not know how many archives were destroyed by flood, fire, erosion, looting, rebuilding, or simple neglect. We do not know whether the earliest tablets preserve myths and stories that have not survived, because the tablets we have are overwhelmingly administrative. Those are real mysteries, but an unanswered question is not evidence for every possible answer. If a tablet cannot be translated, that does not mean it describes electricity, spacecraft, or knowledge from a non-human source. If an ancient story says kingship descended from heaven, that does not automatically mean someone came down from the sky in a machine. Ancient people used divine language to explain authority, disaster, fertility, war, and the terrifying fact that human life depended on forces no ruler could control. Their heavens were full of gods because their world was full of uncertainty. And our uncertainty about them should not be used to erase their achievements. The people of Uruk did not need help from aliens to create cities, accounting, monumental architecture, trade networks, or writing. They had something more powerful and more historically believable. Thousands of years of human experimentation, generations of farmers learning rivers, builders learning mud brick, craftspeople learning materials, administrators learning how to organize labor, priests building institutions, traders connecting distant regions, scribes discovering that a mark could outlive a voice. That is extraordinary enough. Still, there is a final reason the speculation never completely dies. The earliest signs sit at the threshold of history. Behind them lies a vast prehistoric world with no written testimony at all. We know people lived, traded, migrated, fought, loved, buried their dead, and told stories for tens of thousands of years before Uruk's scribes pressed their first tablets. But those people left no sentences explaining themselves. The silence is enormous, and somewhere inside that silence may be memories we will never recover. Not proof of a fantasy civilization, perhaps, but evidence of real societies whose names are gone, whose languages are gone, whose achievements survive only indirectly in the cities and traditions that came after them. The first writing did not suddenly create the human past. It gave the past a chance to speak, and even now, 5 millennia later, much of what it says is still waiting in the clay. And that waiting is not passive. The clay is still speaking. Not because the tablets change, but because the evidence around them changes. A sign that seemed meaningless 50 years ago may become clearer when archaeologists uncover another tablet using the same sign in a slightly different context. A broken fragment in one museum may turn out to join a fragment stored in another collection on the other side of the world. A sequence once read as a personal name may prove to be a title, a place, a profession, or a category of goods. Every new piece has the power to rearrange the old ones. But first, there is a problem that makes this work far harder than it should be. Thousands of ancient Mesopotamian tablets have no provenience. That means nobody can say exactly where they were found, what building they came from, what layer of soil contained them, what other objects were beside them, or whether they belong to a temple archive, a household, a workshop, or a rubbish dump. Many entered collections through the antiquities market, especially during periods when sites were poorly protected, excavations were uncontrolled, or looters were digging faster than archaeologists could record what was being destroyed. A looted tablet may still be genuine. Its signs may still be ancient. It may still contain information nobody has seen for 5,000 years. But it has lost part of its meaning. Imagine finding a single page of a modern accounting ledger in a field. You can read the words, you can see the numbers, but without knowing whether it came from a bank, a hospital, a military base, a grocery store, or somebody's private desk, the page becomes harder to understand. Was this number a payment, a debt, a delivery, a list of workers? A record of grain. The words survive, but the system around them is gone. That is what looting destroys. Not just objects, relationships. A tablet found in a sealed room, alongside hundreds of other tablets, can reveal an entire administrative system. The order in which documents were stored may matter. The seal impressions on their surfaces may connect officials to institutions. Animal bones, pottery, tools, and architecture can tell us what kind of place produced the records. Even the location of a tablet on a floor can matter. Was it dropped during a fire, filed in a container, thrown away after the account was finished? Once a tablet is removed without documentation, those clues are scattered forever. And yet even damaged, displaced, and incomplete tablets can sometimes be brought back into the conversation. Museums and research collections hold enormous numbers of tablets, including pieces excavated legally decades ago but never fully studied. Some are famous. Others have spent generations in drawers, boxes, or storerooms, catalogued but unpublished, waiting for a specialist who can recognize a sign sequence or compare a fragment with another text. This is one reason the earliest writing is still emerging from silence. The archive is not closed, it may not even be fully opened. Conservation has become part of decipherment. Clay looks permanent, but ancient tablets are fragile. Salt can crystallize inside them. Moisture can weaken them. Old repairs can hide signs. Dirt lodged in wedges and incisions can make one sign resemble another. Before scholars can read a tablet, conservators may have to stabilize it, clean it carefully, and preserve every surviving mark without accidentally erasing evidence. Then comes photography. High-resolution images can reveal details difficult to see under normal conditions. Faint lines, erased marks, damaged corners, seal impressions, and tiny differences in the depth and direction of wedges. Three-dimensional imaging can go even further. By mapping the surface of the clay, it allows researchers to examine a tablet from angles impossible to achieve with a photograph alone. A shallow sign, nearly invisible in one light, may become obvious when its surface is modelled in 3 dimensions. And now, increasingly, those images are being placed online. Digital archives allow scholars in different countries to compare tablets without waiting for travel permissions, shipping fragile objects, or relying on old hand copies made a century ago. A researcher studying Proto-Cuneiform signs in Berlin can compare images held in London, Paris, Baghdad, Istanbul, Philadelphia, or a regional museum in Iraq. A student may notice a parallel that a senior scholar never had time to search for. A fragment published long ago in a rare catalogue can suddenly become visible to the entire field. That does not mean every mystery will be solved by putting it on the internet, but it changes the scale of the search. Instead of one person staring at one tablet, scholars can search across thousands. And this is where computers are beginning to help. Machine learning systems can be trained to recognize repeated sign shapes, identify possible numerical patterns, match seal impressions, or flag tablets that may belong to the same scribal tradition. They can search far faster than a human, through a huge body of digitized material. They may notice that an unusual sign appears beside the same commodity sign in 20 different tablets. They may find that a damaged fragment has a probable match in another collection. They can help turn a mountain of clay into patterns a human mind can investigate. But a computer does not automatically translate an ancient world. It can recognize similarities. It cannot, by itself, decide what those similarities meant to the people of Uruk. A sign might look identical, but carry different meanings in different contexts. A repeated pattern may reflect grammar, accounting practice, local bureaucracy, scribal habit, or something we have not yet imagined. The earliest tablets are not clean data sets. They are broken records from a vanished society, written in a system still becoming writing. Human judgment remains essential. Scholars have to ask questions no algorithm can settle on its own. Is this sign really the same sign, or just a similar shape made by another hand? Does this numerical notation count sheep, containers, land, Labor Days, or something else entirely? Is this sequence language, a label, a name, or a code understood only inside one institution? And when a new parallel appears, old translations can change. That is not failure. That is how decipherment works. A reading published with confidence in one generation may be revised in the next because someone finds a better preserved tablet, a new bilingual clue, a duplicate account, or a previously overlooked connection between signs. The goal is not to force every tablet into a final answer as quickly as possible. The goal is to build the most accurate explanation the evidence can support, and then remain willing to change it when the clay gives us more. So the earliest writing is not a sealed message from the dead. It is an unfinished conversation. Every fragment recovered responsibly, every collection digitized, every sign re-examined, every mistaken reading corrected, brings us a little closer to the people who pressed these marks into wet clay before our recorded world had fully begun. Translation is not a final verdict. It is a process. And somewhere in a museum drawer beneath the soil of ancient Mesopotamia, or hidden in a fragment no one has yet recognized, another piece of that conversation may still be waiting. And that is what these tablets really leave us. Not proof of a vanished super-civilization erased from history. Not a secret chronicle describing a world before human beings. Not a completed message that scholars are somehow refusing to reveal. The sensational version of this story is tempting because the tablets are so old, so strange, and so incomplete. You look at those dense clusters of signs, numbers, containers, animals, people, and unknown categories, and it is easy to imagine forbidden knowledge trapped inside the clay. But the documented reality is more remarkable than the fantasy. Because these tablets show us the moment human societies began building systems powerful enough to outlast the people who created them. They show a world becoming organized at a scale our ancestors had never known before. Uruk was not just a settlement with a lot of people living close together. It was an urban experiment on a massive scale. Fields had to produce enough grain to feed people who were no longer farming. Herds had to be counted, rations had to be measured. Workers had to be assigned, goods had to move from one place to another. Temples, storehouses, workshops, and households had to coordinate resources across seasons. And eventually, memory alone was not enough. That is where the clay comes in. The earliest tablets do not give us grand speeches. They do not introduce themselves with, "This is the story of our people." They do not explain what the scribes believed about the universe, what songs they sang, what frightened them at night, or what made them laugh. Instead, they give us things that may seem almost painfully ordinary. Grain, beer, sheep, textiles, labour, land, containers. Rations, totals, names perhaps, titles perhaps, categories we can identify only imperfectly. But ordinary records can reveal extraordinary things. A society that records rations has people dependent on an institution for food. A society that counts workers has organized labor. A society that distinguishes one kind of vessel from another has standardized measures, standardized expectations, and people trained to recognize the difference. A society that produces long lists of animals, professions, places, plants, objects, and signs is trying to classify its world. And classification is never just about knowledge, it is about power. Once you can name, count, sort, and record something, you can manage it from a distance. You can compare what arrived with what was expected. You can identify shortages. You can demand deliveries. You can distribute resources. You can make decisions that affect hundreds or thousands of people without personally seeing every field, every flock, every worker, and every storehouse. Writing did not create inequality by itself. Human societies had hierarchy long before anyone pressed a sign into clay. But writing gave institutions a new kind of memory. A memory that did not die when one official died. A memory that could be checked, copied, stoled, passed to the next generation. That may be one of the deepest transformations in the whole story. Before writing, knowledge lived mainly in people. It was carried in voices, habits, demonstrations, stories, rituals, and repeated acts. A skilled elder could teach a younger person how to plant, hunt, weave, build, trade, or remember the obligations between families. But knowledge could be lost when people died, scattered, or forgot. The tablet changed that. Not all knowledge went into clay. Most of life probably never did. But some kinds of knowledge could now be separated from the human mind. A number could remain on a tablet after the person who counted the sheep was gone. A list could survive after the goods had been consumed. A name or title could endure after its owner had disappeared from every living memory. That is why these fragments feel so close to us, and so distant. We can still recognize the logic of a count. We understand why grain was measured, why workers received rations, why officials wanted records, why institutions needed inventories. In that sense, the first writing is deeply familiar. Modern life is still built on lists, categories, receipts, accounts, schedules, taxes, contracts, and records. The systems have become larger. The clay has become paper, then screens, then data stored in machines. But the impulse is recognizable, to make the world legible. To turn a harvest into a number, to turn labor into an entry, to turn a living, changing reality into something that can be stored, compared, controlled, and remembered. And yet the earliest tablets remain stubbornly unfamiliar. We do not know the value of every sign. We do not know whether every sequence represents spoken Sumerian, a technical shorthand, a local administrative code, personal names, institutional labels, or something more complicated. We do not know the exact purpose of every tablet. Some were probably routine accounts. Some may have been temporary notes. Some may have been training exercises for scribes. Some may have belonged to archives whose other documents are still buried, destroyed, scattered, or sitting unidentified in museum collections. We do not know how much has vanished. Clay survives better than papyrus, wood, leather, cloth, and human memory. But survival is not completeness. For every tablet recovered, there may have been many that dissolved, broke, were reused, were discarded, or never reached the ground in a condition archaeology could preserve. And the greatest absences are not always the missing tablets. They are the missing voices. The people who appear in the records are often reduced to categories. Workers, labour groups, recipients of rations, producers of cloth, handlers of animals, people attached to institutions whose names and lives are difficult to recover. We can see the system counting them, but we cannot always hear them speaking back. We do not know what a textile worker thought about the officials who recorded her output. We do not know whether a labourer receiving grain felt protected, exploited, grateful, angry, or all of those things at once. We do not know what people outside the great institutions made of this new technology. Did writing seem useful, sacred, intimidating? Did it belong to everyone, or did it feel like the specialized power of administrators and scribes? The clay does not tell us enough, at least not yet, and that is the irony at the center of the entire story. Humanity's earliest writing survives. It survived flood, fire, collapse, conquest, looting, burial, and 5,000 years beneath the earth. It survived precisely because it was made from mud. But much of what it means remains beyond our reach. Not because the past is hiding a final answer from us, but because the first writing was never designed for us. These tablets were made for people who already understood the system, people who knew what a particular sign meant in that office, in that storehouse, in that year, under that official, for that category of goods. The scribes did not need to explain every assumption. Their readers lived inside the world the tablets described. We do not. We arrive 5 millennia late, holding fragments of their records, trying to reconstruct an entire civilization from marks that were once as ordinary as a warehouse receipt. And maybe that is what makes them so powerful. Mystery is not diminished when we treat evidence carefully. It becomes deeper. The real mystery is not that the tablets prove something impossible. The real mystery is that ordinary human beings, in one of the world's first cities, created a way to make information outlive the moment it was needed. They began a chain of record-keeping that leads, in one form or another, all the way to us. Every spreadsheet, every inventory, every census, every bill, every archive, every message preserved after its sender is gone. All of it belongs to a world that began, in part, with marks pressed into wet clay at Uruk. And even now, the first writers have not finished speaking. If this journey into the oldest writing on Earth gave you a new way to see the past, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. I would genuinely love to know how far this story has travelled from the ancient plains of Mesopotamia. And if you want to support the channel in the best possible way, listen to the shows on Spotify through the link in the description, because somewhere in the clay, beneath a sign we cannot yet read, the next part of the story may still be waiting.